Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that on all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Members of the Legislative Assembly, it is my honor to introduce Maurice Heroff, Conflict of Interest Commissioner and Lobbyist Registrar for the Province of Saskatchewan. Mr. Heroff was appointed by the Legislative Assembly to the role of Conflict of Interest Commissioner and Lobbyist Registrar on July 1st, 2020. However, due to COVID restrictions, this is the first time he is being introduced in the House. Sitting with Mr. Heroff are members of his family, friends, and staff from his office. His spouse, Dorothy Heroff, brother, Cyril Heroff, sisters, Sally Schneider, brother-in-law, Keith Schneider, brother-in-law, Blair Buchanan, and staff, Sandra Arbery, and staff, Ron Samways. I invite all members to join me at a come-and-go welcome reception for Mr. Heroff this afternoon in the Saskatchewan Gallery from 2:30 to 4. I ask that all members please join me in welcoming Mr. Heroff and his guests to the Legislative Assembly. Introduction of guests. I recognize the member from Lumsden Morris.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce a very special guest seated in your gallery of the Legislative Assembly today. I'm pleased to welcome Marta Cowling, Consul General of Portugal in Vancouver. This is the Consul General's first visit to our province. We hope that this is an occasion for our regions to learn more about each other and reflect on how Saskatchewan and Portugal can work together for the benefit of our citizens and our economies. Ms. Cowling has a busy schedule while she's in Regina, meeting with representatives from government, industry, and academia in Regina and Saskatoon. Mr. Speaker, we are pleased to work with the Consul General to grow Saskatchewan's relationship with Portugal. Our province is home to almost 2,000 Portuguese people. In 2020, Saskatchewan exports to Portugal were valued at more than $39 million, with canola seed, durum wheat, and other crops being our top export products. In fact, Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan accounts for 31% of all of Canada's exports to Portugal. In addition, Saskatchewan is Portugal's top supplier of canola seed, canary seed, and lentils. We see many opportunities to expand our trading relationship and collaborate in the future, especially on research in the areas of agriculture, biotech, and energy. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to continuing to grow and deepen the friendship we have with the Portuguese people. We are honored to have the Consul General with us today, and I ask that all members of this Assembly join me in welcoming our distinguished guest to Saskatchewan's Legislative Assembly and to our province.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to join the member opposite in welcoming the Consul General of Portugal here to our Legislative Assembly. É realmente prazer dizer bem-vindo à relação que a gente tem com a população de Portugal e também a população lusófona de todo o mundo, brasileiro, de África portuguesa. Toda essa gente, é muito importante essa relação. Então, obrigado pela visita e bem-vindo.
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you, in your gallery, I'd like to introduce a delegation from the Saskatchewan Construction Association. With us today, Mr. Speaker, Mark Cooper, Kevin Dureau, Shannon Friesen, Miles Dick, Sean Cripps, Jeff Haggerty, Colin Olford, and Curtis Kincaid. Mr. Speaker, the Construction Association plays plays a vital role, a very good supporting role in supporting the construction industry in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, they're certainly strong advocates for their industry. I had the great privilege of working with the association in the development of our procurement transformation when the government was involved in that work, Mr. Speaker, and most recently with respect to the development of our prompt payment regime, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, it's always interested to hear their perspectives on issues that affect the industry so that the government can continue to support a vital industry in this province, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to our ongoing dialogue with respect to those issues. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask all colleagues to welcome these delegates from the Saskatchewan Construction Association to their assembly.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd request leave for an extended introduction.
Leave has been requested for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Carried.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you and to all members, I'd like to join with the minister opposite in welcoming the delegation from the SAS Construction Association here to their assembly. I believe in attendance, I know we have Mark, and we have, I think I got all the names, Miles, Sean, Jeff, Jen, Colin, and Curtis. Apologies, I fear I may have missed Kevin? And Kevin. Sorry, Kevin. Save the best for last. It's my absolute pleasure to have the SAS Construction Association here and to welcome you. I know you provide such sterling member services, significant trusted leadership to your organization. You are strong advocates for critical investment and a dynamic industry here in Saskatchewan, as well as I know you do incredibly good work and promoting a prosperous industry and a better quality of life for all in Saskatchewan. So I'd like to thank you for your work. Look forward to meeting with you later and welcome you to this, your legislature. And Mr. Speaker, while I'm on my feet, I would also like to take a moment to welcome to their legislature sitting in the East Gallery, a class of, I believe, 20 grade 12 students from Campbell Collegiate. Good afternoon, welcome. We are so glad that you're here. And I look forward to meeting with you later, and I promise that this time I will not use unparliamentary language in answering your questions, much to my embarrassment, but a warm welcome to the students seated opposite and their teacher, the great Aaron Harlos. And Mr. Speaker, last but not least, I would like to give just a special personal welcome to Maurice, who I believe is a constituent of mine, and also to the fantastic Sandra Arbery, who's seated in the Speaker's Gallery, who I probably shouldn't single out, but had the misfortune of being my very first boss when I first moved to the province of Saskatchewan. So welcome to all of you, and thank you. I look forward to meeting with you all later.
Recognize a member from Arm River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to request leave for an extended introduction.
The member has requested leave for an extended introduction. Is leave granted? Carried.
Mr. Speaker, to you and through you and to all members, I'm excited to introduce and welcome two incredible constituents of mine seated in your gallery, Jocelyn Weichel and Katie Vollmer. In Arm River, while we believe in developing talent, we also strongly believe in importing it as well. Jocelyn and Katie are two of these fabulous imports. Jocelyn hails from Regina and brings with her an extensive knowledge and experience in the construction industry. Katie was plucked from Ontario and comes with a background in political science and research. These two energetic go-getters now call farms in the RM of Lorburn home. Community is certainly important to these two. These two ladies share a growth mindset and a persistence that makes them definitely an asset for the area and the province as a whole. This was never made more evident than when they worked through the development phase of the beautiful Line 19 multiplex facility under construction now in Elbow. Arm River is fortunate to have snagged Katie and Jocelyn, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I would ask all members to help me welcome Katie and Jocelyn to their legislature.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you, I'd like to send a warm welcome up to your gallery where Katie Edwards and Chris Bueller are seated. Katie is my constituency assistant in Eastview, and I got to say she is just doing such an incredible job, and I couldn't be happier to have someone like Katie to work with each and every day. Katie is somebody that I knew of and knew for a long time. We attended the same church for a period of time, and I knew of her work for most of the last 10 years in Saskatoon, working with newcomers, refugees, and migrant workers with organizations like Mennonite Central Committee and the Open Door Society. And so her reputation preceded her, and I was excited to see her apply to come and work with me in Eastview. Katie recently completed a master's in community economic development, but what really makes her an exceptional CA is what she brings to the table as a person. She's organized and intelligent, but she's also compassionate and caring, and just the exact kind of person you want to be there when folks walk in through the door, bringing their troubles and their concerns and looking for help. One particular example comes to mind. We found our office is in Market Mall, and we get a lot of seniors come by, and Katie really stepped up to the plate to help seniors access their proof of vaccine. She's joined by Chris, and together they operate Floating Gardens, a farm on a Century Family Farm in Osler, Saskatchewan. They grow produce year-round, and it's some of the best tasting produce in the province. Two exceptional individuals, thank you for being here. Welcome to your legislature.
Recognize a member from Martensville-Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To you and through you this afternoon, I'd like to introduce to the House this afternoon a member of the lacrosse royalty in this province. Seated in your gallery is number 77 of the Saskatchewan Rush, Jeff Shatler. Jeff was originally drafted 10th overall in 2005 by Buffalo, Mr. Speaker. He played one season before being traded to Calgary, where he played 12 more seasons. Before I get into some other things that Jeff does in the community, I think it's pretty appropriate that I do kind of go through his career a little bit, being that this is going to be his final season as a professional lacrosse player in the National Lacrosse League. He came to the Rush as a free agent in 2018. He added some immediate firepower to the lineup. He's the guy that you sometimes see at games after he scores a big goal on a Rush. He'll climb the glass like Spider-Man and jump down to the crowd's delight. He was named playoff MVP in 2018 when the Rush won their second NLL Cup in 3 years, and he was a big part of that. Over his career, Mr. Speaker, Jeff has played 219 career regular season games, 326 goals, 818 points. Absolutely phenomenal numbers. In the playoffs, 31 games played, 37 goals, and 105 points. He's basically unstoppable on the floor, Mr. Speaker. Jeff is married to Lindsay, and he's the father of two wonderful children, Jace and Ada. And he's not just a future Hall of Fame pro lacrosse player, Mr. Speaker, but Jeff played in the Ontario Junior Hockey League and was offered an NCAA scholarship to play at Cornell. But he opted for lacrosse instead. And I'd say it's worked out pretty good for him and for the fans of the Saskatchewan Rush. Would you please join me in welcoming Jeff Shatler to his Saskatchewan legislature?
I recognize a member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to join with the member and to welcome a Saskatchewan legend on the lacrosse scene, a legend well beyond Saskatchewan on the lacrosse scene, Jeff Shatler, to his assembly. Thank you so very much for joining us here today. I'd also like to identify how much you give back to the community, and I want to recognize all of the coaching and the support for lacrosse across Saskatchewan, and specifically all of your coaching and support for that incredible team out at Standing Buffalo First Nation, the Fighting Sioux. You certainly are a lacrosse legend. Saskatchewan is lucky to have your leadership within our province. The Saskatchewan Rush have been made stronger by your efforts and your play, but you've really developed sport across Saskatchewan. And I know as it relates to the Fighting Sioux, that incredible team out there at Standing Buffalo, I know you've been instrumental in their success. So it's my honor to join with the member opposite to welcome Jeff Shatler to his assembly.
Recognize the Minister of Energy and Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In your gallery, I would like to introduce Alan Tomarat, certainly no stranger to many in this Assembly. Alan is a great believer and promoter of good governance, and certainly he practices what he preaches, Mr. Speaker. He's been the Mayor of Thode in my constituency for 12 years and has served that and other communities very well on a range of public utility and regional planning boards. He's also the founder of Galt Resources Strategy Group and my constituency vice president, transitioning to president this year, and we're very, very lucky to have him, and certainly I am. With him is Rick Smith, Mr. Speaker, former SGI board member, senior vice president of Henderson Insurance, and chair of the Canadian Home Builders Association. Please welcome Mr. Smith, Mr. Speaker, and my friend Alan to their Legislative Assembly.
Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today to present a petition to the Government of Saskatchewan to stop the closures at Wilkie and District Health Centre. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that the Saskatchewan Health Authority is unable to provide reliable and consistent healthcare services in Wilkie. The Health Centre Emergency Department has been regularly closed for years. Several rural communities rely on Wilkie and District Health Centre for health services, and the hospital is a key component to the economic vitality of the region. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to stop closing emergency department and outpatient services at Wilkie and District Health Centre. This is signed by individuals from Biggar. Mr. Speaker, I do so present.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise again today to present our petition calling for pay equity legislation. Those who have signed the petition today wish to bring to our attention the following points. Saskatchewan is one of only 4 provinces that does not have pay equity legislation. Saskatchewan has one of the highest gender wage gaps in Canada, which is the result of systemic gender discrimination in compensation for work, which must be corrected by pay equity legislation. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has recommended proactive and comprehensive pay equity legislation, which has not been pursued by the Government of Saskatchewan. While the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code prohibits gender-based compensation discrimination, the complaint-driven process puts no positive obligation on employers. That while pay equity advocacy primarily seeks to address gender-based wage discrimination, it must also be mindful of ability, age, identity, and race-based wage discrimination. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to introduce pay equity legislation. Mr. Speaker, today the petition has been signed by residents of Saskatoon and Regina. I do so present.
Recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to be on my feet to again present a petition calling on this government to reverse changes and cuts brought about under the new Saskatchewan Income Support Program, or SIS. Unlike its predecessors, Mr. Speaker, SIS does not directly pay for housing or utilities. It no longer guarantees that folks' utility bills will be covered. It has led to a sharp increase in rental arrears, evictions, and it has further aggravated the homelessness crisis we're seeing across the province. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I will read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly call on the Government of Saskatchewan to restore direct payment of rent and utilities for income support clients. The signatories of this petition reside in Regina, Mr. Speaker. I do so present.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon-Nutana.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to present a petition to the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan against the $150 electric vehicle tax. Citizens are concerned that this punitive tax sends the wrong message and will act as a disincentive to electrical vehicle adoption. Presently, Saskatchewan has approximately 600 fully electric vehicles registered out of a total 1.4 million. The government's flawed rationale is that the annual tax will help pay for the wear and tear from electric vehicles operating on provincial roads and highways. This, despite the fact the Sask Party government has not invested in fast-charging infrastructure, limiting EV drivers' ability to use many roads and highways across our province. Leading U of S economist Joel Bruneau suggests that piling a $150 surcharge on top of the estimated $210 EV owners will pay for vehicle home charging means early adopters are already paying more than their fair share and can hardly be accused of free riding. I will read the prayer. We in the prayer that reads as follows respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the provincial government to cancel the $150 tax on electric vehicles and invest in charging stations to encourage electrical vehicle use in Saskatchewan. This petition is signed by residents in Saskatoon and Regina. I so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Member statements. I recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview. Eastview.
What a weekend for football in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. I rise to congratulate the University of Saskatchewan for their UTEC Bowl victory on Saturday that earned them a trip to the national final of the Vanier Cup. This epic win over the top-ranked team in the country had all the May Kings of an instant classic. A defensive struggle through the first half saw the Huskies down 4-1 at halftime. That's more of a hockey score. Their defense kept them in the game throughout the third quarter, and then the fourth quarter came along. Led by quarterback Mason Nias, running back Adam Mackert, some key catches from receivers Sam Baker and Colton Clausen, a near-flawless O-line play, the Huskies moved the ball fourth quarter. Running back Adam Mackert scored on a short pass on the first play of the fourth, and then an electrifying, game-winning 13-yard run with only 5 seconds on the clock. Now, my son Tom and I have enjoyed watching all 3 Husky playoff wins so far, and I asked him what he thought, and in his words, he said Adam Mackert was a machine in the fourth quarter, but also the whole team gave 100%. They showed me how important it is for every member to give their best effort for the team. That's how the Huskies play, and that's why they're going to win the Vanier. Congratulations to Coach Flory and his outstanding coaching staff and all members of the U of S Huskies. With the Riders headed to the Western Final and the Huskies headed to the Vanier, I ask all members to join me in showing these 2 great teams our full support. Thank you.
Recognize a member from the Battlefords.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a bit of a challenge this week in the Battlefords, and that challenge is finding a place for all the volleyball trophies that our local teams are bringing back to our community. We just don't know where to put them, Mr. Speaker. 2 weekends ago, the North Battleford Comprehensive girls won a bronze medal at the 5A level, and at the 4A level, our John Paul II Collegiate girls won a silver medal. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the John Paul II Collegiate boys for winning a provincial championship at the 4A level this past weekend, and, Mr. Speaker, doing so in quite impressive fashion. I was looking at the results last night, and this Crusaders team only lost 1 set all weekend long. Wow. Now, these are significant achievements that are earned with months and years of hard work, as well as with the support of many volunteer coaches and parents. Now, given the success of the North Battleford teams, as well as teams from Wilkie, Unity, Maidstone, and Edam medaling, I think it might be safe to say that the Northwest region might have the highest rate of volleyball medals per 100,000 people. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask all members in the House to join me in congratulating these Northwest teams, as well as all other teams participating in volleyball provincials over the last 2 weekends here in Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Recognize a member from Regina Lakeview.
This month, the Education Minister stepped in to overrule a local medical health officer who was trying to protect students attending volleyball provincials at a school in active outbreak. His reason, Mr. Speaker, He'd heard from some constituents with unvaccinated children on the volleyball team. Putting his own constituency politics ahead of health and safety of the students that he's sworn to serve. The Minister of Education should be showing real leadership and actively campaigning to increase vaccinations in our schools. That's his job. Instead, we get evasive statements and dog whistle politics to a small vocal base about 2 classes of students and forced vaccinations. Let me be perfectly clear, there is not a politician, doctor, or teacher in this country who is calling for forced vaccinations of children. The very notion that this minister and his government would stoop to the level of lifting lines from QAnon is dangerous and besmirches the office that they hold. Vaccine hesitancy thrives when political leaders choose to pander to the very rhetoric that feeds those fears, rather than delivering clear and concise messaging about the health and community benefit of vaccines. Unfortunately, it's become obvious over the last year that leadership is a quality sorely lacking on the government benches, including the Minister of Education. The students of this province deserve so much more, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize a member from Regina Walsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise today and recognize Solomon Ratt, a good Walsh Acres constituent, as one of this year's recipients of the Saskatchewan Order of Merit. Solomon was born at a trapper's cabin 4 miles north of Stanley Mission on the banks of the Churchill River. At the age of 6, he was taken from his family and placed in a Prince Albert residential school where he would spend 10 months of the year away from his loved ones, language, and his culture. Now, despite this, Mr. Speaker, he maintained his language by speaking Cree with other students and family when possible. In his adult life, Solomon was recruited to teach Cree at the First Nations University of Canada. He teaches Cree literacy, vocabulary, grammar, oral traditions, old legends, new stories, traditional prayers, and modern poems, all of which convey life lessons and important cultural values. Solomon is a highly accomplished author and a main contributor to the Cree Literacy Network, Cree Word of the Day, and the Cree Language Videos Facebook page. His utilization of humor, among other talents, earned him universal admiration and regard as a role model and a mentor by his students and colleagues. And Mr. Speaker, I had a chance to talk with Solomon at that ceremony. He's a man that is full of life, full of energy, and full of great stories. I ask all members of this assembly to join me in congratulating Solomon Ratt for the vital work he does for the preservation of Indigenous languages. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The White Ribbon Campaign started 30 years ago in the wake of the Montreal Massacre that took the lives of 14 women. White ribbons are worn as a pledge to never commit, condone, or remain silent about gender-based violence and discrimination. This year, a dedicated group of 16 men from Moose Jaw called for a future where there is no violence against women and girls. This group included local business owners, city councillors, teachers, police officers, firefighters, EMS, and others. Each of the 16 participants represented a day in the 16 days of activism leading up to Human Rights Day on December the 10th. Mr. Speaker, last Wednesday night, that same group of men spent the night outside to raise funds and awareness for the Moose Jaw Transition House, a home for women and children escaping situations of domestic violence. The fundraising target set by these 16 men was $8,000, $500 each. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to say that they raised over $27,000 for the Transition House. Mr. Speaker, those dollars will fund programming, outreach, and supports for women and children in our community. I ask all members of this Assembly to join me in recognizing those 16 men from Moose Jaw and in expressing our support for the efforts of all those working toward a future where there is no violence against women and girls. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Martensville-Warman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's many professional athletes here in Saskatchewan that serve as role models for young people. In 2018, we gained another one. Jeff Schattler signed as a free agent with the Saskatchewan Rush, and he and his wife put down roots in our province. Mr. Speaker, Jeff knows a lot about winning and the hard work that goes into it. In 2011, he was named the National Lacrosse League's Transition Player of the Year, as well as MVP. He's a two-time NLL champion with the Calgary Roughnecks in 2009 and with the Rush in 2018, when he was also named playoff MVP. Mr. Speaker, Jeff is here with us today as he embarks on his final pro lacrosse season in just under 2 weeks. As an Indigenous role model, Jeff has done so many good things for our young people in our province. In February of 2019, he established the Shatler Lacrosse Academy and also serves as Director of Player Development and Coaching for the Fighting Sioux Lacrosse program at Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation. Jeff's also involved, Mr. Speaker, in establishing a Nations Cup between 8 reserves in the Standing Buffalo Dakota Nation and File Hills Qu'Appelle Tribal Council Treaty 4 area. Mr. Speaker, he also dedicates his time to clinics and programs that aim to expand opportunities for girls lacrosse, including working with the Queen's Lacrosse of the Queen City Minor Box Lacrosse League, the first all-girls lacrosse team in Regina. Mr. Speaker, we are truly blessed and thankful to have somebody like Jeff Shatler and his family calling Saskatchewan home, and we wish him all the best in his final season with the Saskatchewan Rush. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Lumsden Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The week of November 22nd marked the 50th show for the Canadian Western Agribition. Agribition is one of the biggest livestock shows in this country. It brings producers, businesses, delegates, visitors from across the globe to our province. Mr. Speaker, over 100 international buyers from nearly 50 countries registered. There were over 2,500 livestock animals. This included 12 different cattle breeds, as well as alpacas, sheep, bison, horses, and more. It was exciting to see CWA back in action after moving events online last year. The PAC trade show, award ceremonies, and competitions brought the best of Saskatchewan and Canada to the world stage. Mr. Speaker, the agriculture industry will help our economy recover from the pandemic, and Agribition is a great demonstration of this. The show adds over $73 million to the provincial economy every year. And Mr. Speaker, our confidence in the event is so strong that we have renewed our sponsorship, providing $50,000 a year for the next 5 years. I ask all members to join me in congratulating Canadian Western Agribition on another successful year and their 50th anniversary show. Thank you.
Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 35,000 people currently waiting for surgery in our province. That number is set to increase to over 40,000 in the new year. To the Premier, what's the plan to not just get back to near normal capacity, but to expand our surgical capacity and get all of those people so anxiously waiting the care they need and deserve?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've spoken numerous times about surgical capacity, as well as the other programs and services that are offered across the Saskatchewan Health Authority as well, Mr. Speaker, which is the operational arm delivering health care to Saskatchewan residents. We have resumption plans that have been put in place throughout this month, up to and including the end of the month, for all of the programs and services that are being resumed as we speak, Mr. Speaker. There is a small contingent of folks that we are keeping available so that we can operate the vaccination plans that are right now being offered to our youth, the 5 to 11-year-olds, as well as the broader population as well, Mr. Speaker, and then incorporating some booster doses as booster doses ultimately open up over the course of the next number of weeks. Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Health and the Saskatchewan Health Authority have resumed many of our surgeries, in particular any of those that are highly prioritized, Mr. Speaker, and many, I believe, we're up to about 85% of our surgical capacity as we speak here today, or that was the last briefing that I had received late last week. Mr. Speaker, and we not only will be up to a surgical capacity that will be able to be sustainable out into the future, Mr. Speaker, we're actively working, the Ministry of Health, the Saskatchewan Health Authority are actively working on what we can do to reduce the backlog that we ultimately have today due to COVID-19.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, less than half of the workers that have been deployed have been put back on service. When the Premier says 85%, he's talking about the total number, not the total work, because it's the simplest surgeries that are being done. The most serious, the most complicated surgeries, these aren't happening because they require hours of OR time. They require inpatient beds, time and space that simply isn't available because Regina and Saskatoon aren't up to capacity because this government failed to get the fourth wave under control, failed to protect our healthcare system. So again, to the Premier, what is the plan to get those most serious surgeries online right away?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the preamble to that question again it simply isn't correct. Mr. Speaker, I've been made aware close to 90% of folks have been returned to their programs and services that they were providing across the Saskatchewan Health Association. Mr. Speaker, we've seen a number of families in this legislature, and I know MLAs, but likely on both sides, have talked to a number of families across the province that are looking at and are now experiencing the resumption of their services, Mr. Speaker, and we see a number of families as well experiencing the resumptions of their surgeries that they have been waiting for, Mr. Speaker. We're up to about 85% capacity, our surgical capacity here in the province. We'll be moving that along in the days and weeks ahead, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be coming forward with a plan in the very near future on how we're going to reduce the backlog, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition was correct about the fact that we have climbed, our surgical wait time has climbed to 35,000 cases, Mr. Speaker. We've had a backlog before in this province, Mr. Speaker. We found ways, innovative ways to get through and reduce that backlog, Mr. Speaker. We're going to need to do that again. We have a track record here, Mr. Speaker, and the people of the province can be assured that it's this government, Mr. Speaker, that is going to not only reduce the wait times for surgeries in this province, but we're going to ensure that the capacity that we have is sustainable into the future.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we're talking about the workers who've been undeployed, returned to service, only half were eligible. So we're only nearing half. That clarity and honesty about numbers matters, and it also matters to patients because it determines who's available to give them the care that they need. One of those patients, a patient in desperate need of care and with no surgical date in sight, is Stephanie Brett. Stephanie is here with us today in the Assembly, in the Speaker's Gallery. She's joined by her husband, Mike. Stephanie has been waiting for an urgent bladder removal surgery. This is not optional. It's not elective. This is a serious, urgent surgical procedure. Stephanie was ready to have that operation on October the 23rd. Instead, it was outright canceled. And she continues to live in extreme pain and deal with the stress of still, over a month later, having no idea, no communication at all about when she might get the treatment she needs. Does the Premier recognize the devastating impact that his decision to not take the fourth wave seriously has had on Stephanie and so many others who've had their surgeries canceled?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to welcome Stephanie to her Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, we had to take some very drastic action when, in the middle of September, when our numbers were increasingly climbing, Mr. Speaker, and we had overwhelmed by people that were unvaccinated, Mr. Speaker. We needed to make sure that we had our hospital system protected, Mr. Speaker. We needed to make very difficult decisions. I'd be more than happy to be able to sit down and talk with Stephanie about this, but as far as prioritizing who gets on the surgical, that's a clinical decision. That's not a decision that should ever land in the Minister's office, Mr. Speaker, because that's not a decision that I'm prepared to make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is happy to take his feet and spin numbers, but when faced with a real human being, with the real cost of his decision, he hangs his head and turns his back, again and again and again. Stephanie has 4 daughters. Her illness has had a tremendous impact on their well-being, a tremendous impact on her family's finances. This is incredibly stressful, and yet Stephanie is still in the dark about when she'll get surgery. Every day, she's in pain. Every day she waits, it gets worse. The spin this Premier is using, cherry-picking numbers that reflect the simplest procedures instead of being honest about the real shortfalls and the real work ahead, it does a disservice to Stephanie and all those who are waiting. What is the Premier doing? To the Premier, what is he doing to make sure that urgent, serious cases like hers are getting addressed right away?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I put on the record that, Mr. Speaker, there are no urgent surgeries or emergent surgeries that have been cancelled to my knowledge in the last few weeks, Mr. Speaker. So again, this is a clinical decision where this lands, Mr. Speaker, but I can tell, and as the Premier outlined, what the Leader of the Opposition was saying is not accurate, Mr. Speaker. We have returned 93% of eligible staff back to their positions, Mr. Speaker. When we were able, throughout this year, which has been a very challenging year, Mr. Speaker, we were able to do 88% of the scheduled surgeries, Mr. Speaker. In that time frame in the summer when our numbers dropped down, Mr. Speaker, and we had a lull in COVID, we were able to complete 95% of the surgeries. I want to thank the people of Saskatchewan for going out and getting their COVID shots, but I also want to thank the frontline workers, the people that are running the surgical units who are able to pivot very quickly, get back up to 90%. Now that the numbers seem to be settling out, Mr. Speaker, in the low 50s, Mr. Speaker, we'll start our surgical resumption right away. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The surgical waiting lists were growing before the pandemic. They started to grow, in fact, around when this Premier took office. 35,000 people waiting and counting, Mr. Speaker. Those numbers aren't shrinking. No one's predicting a decrease. The prediction is that it will top 40,000 in the months ahead, Mr. Speaker. Getting back to normal surgical volumes won't be enough. We need a plan. One that includes more OR nurses, one that includes more inpatient beds, one that includes clinicians around the table, not political decisions coming from the minister's office. Mr. Speaker, when will we see that expert-led, comprehensive plan to address that surgical backlog to get folks like Stephanie the care they so urgently need?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, we will be getting all hands on deck to make sure that we're not just clearing off what has accumulated, but, Mr. Speaker, we're making sure that we're staying ahead of it. A lot of the surgeries, as the member outlined, Mr. Speaker, are day surgeries, which we are working. We're also working with our private sector partners, Mr. Speaker, to be able to perform those surgeries, those scans, and the therapeutic treatment after, Mr. Speaker, to make sure the patients are doing. Is the member opposite supportive of those private clinics that are going to take a huge chunk of the surgical weight down, Mr. Speaker, or is he going to stay in his political dogma, Mr. Speaker, and continue to do what has always been done? On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to use innovative ways to make sure that we're clearing off the surgical backlog, not just what has happened over the past few months, Mr. Speaker, but throughout the entire pandemic. We'll continue to work with the people of Saskatchewan to make sure that they can get their surgeries done in a timely manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, starting to leak out what this government's true plan is to make sure that patients like Stephanie not only have to wait for their surgery, but when they get it, they get a bill. Worst fourth wave in the entire country, the worst death rates in the entire country, the lowest vaccination rates in the entire country, and thousands of people like Stephanie waiting for care. All those added inpatients, all those ICU admissions, all the out-of-province transfers that could have been avoided if this government had taken the advice of the experts seriously, have also taken a tremendous toll on our public finances. Today we learned it's cost over $250 million more in our healthcare system this year alone. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier recognize that his choice, this Premier's choice to put politics ahead of people's lives, in addition to the immeasurable human cost, has dealt a devastating blow to our public finances and our ability to invest in the care so needed by folks like Stephanie?
Recognize the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition is insinuating is absolutely ridiculous. We have had private surgeries being done in this province. Not one person has received a bill or an invoice for this. It is a publicly funded, privately delivered health care, Mr. Speaker. This has been going on for months. And I'll remind the member opposite that this was actually happening under them, Mr. Speaker. They were actually at a fee-for-service under the NDP, Mr. Speaker, with the MRI clinics, but it was only for the Saskatchewan Rough Riders and the Workers' Compensation Board. We've taken that and made that available for everybody else. Mr. Speaker, that member over there, as a physician, should know nobody in Saskatchewan gets a bill for any of their surgeries. I'd ask him to stand up and withdraw and apologize.
Recognize the member from Regina Road.
Mr. Speaker, the actions of that government and the failure have pushed those seeking surgeries out of province, and those folks, some of those folks are certainly stuck with the bill. No doubt, no question. Almost 2 weeks ago, I asked the finance minister some simple, straightforward questions about the cost of her government's mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to the inexcusable and avoidable human costs. She said, wait for the mid-year report, but nothing was reported there today on this front, so I'll ask her again today. How much does each COVID hospitalization cost? How much does each COVID ICU admission cost? And how much does it cost to send each ICU patient and their families out of province for care?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I know the member opposite that just asked that question is the longest sitting opposition member that they have, so it does kind of, it surprises me that he doesn't know the procedures in this House. He will be very happy to know those detailed answers with officials here, with all of the information are there for supplementary estimates. So I know he'll be present when the health supplementary estimates come up in this session, and I'm sure he can ask those questions at that time.
Great. There we go.
Recognize the member from Regina-Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, that's totally unacceptable from that minister. That minister assured Saskatchewan people that she'd have those costs at the release of the mid-year report. Yet there's nothing there. What we know is the government spending at least $250 million more as a direct result of their COVID failures, their mismanagement. Could the minister at least tell us, out of that $250 million, how much is it costing us to send ICU patients and their families out of province?
Recognize the Minister of Finance.
As the member opposite should know, there was a time period when the Manitoba health system was stretched, and we took patients from Manitoba. We did not bill them until that was all done and all the patients had returned. So that is the case, to my knowledge, in Saskatchewan. We have not been billed yet for out-of-province patients.
Recognize the member from Regina-Rosemont.
It's embarrassing and it's wrong that that minister doesn't have answers for Saskatchewan people here today. A former finance minister in this place used to say that hope is not a plan. But for that Sask Party government, that was their plan all along for the fourth wave of COVID-19. They hoped they could ignore Dr. Shahab, hoped they could ignore the modeling, hoped they could ignore the facts when it came to the fourth wave of COVID-19. Today's mid-year report lays out how much the Sask Party's choices have cost Saskatchewan people, in addition to the horrible and inexcusable human costs. Does the finance minister not recognize that her government's failures have had disastrous consequences for people and our public finances?
Hear, hear.
Recognize Minister of Finance.
Speaker, if the member opposite wants to be honest in what is in or wants to portray what is in the mid-year report, he would tell the people of Saskatchewan how we have recovered far faster and far deeper than we ever anticipated we could. He would tell the people of Saskatchewan that every economic indicator is on the rise, Mr. Speaker. He would tell the people of Saskatchewan that the resources are higher than we had anticipated, that our tax intake has been higher than we had anticipated, and that our deficit is largely from supporting the agriculture producers of this province, which we will do each and every time in a far better way than the NDP ever did. We will not have farmers protesting here at the legislature that they did under the NDP, because they cut every single program for rural Saskatchewan.
Recognize the member from Regina-Rosemont.
What a bunch of rubbish, Mr. Speaker. The actual report from that Sask Party government and the economic indicators tell a complete different story. Employment, dead last. New motor vehicle sales, dead last. Total investment in non-residential construction, dead last. Retail sales, wholesale trade right near the bottom. The costs of this government's choices are staggering. People like Stephanie, who can't get the surgery that they need. Baby Helen, who can't get the therapies that they need and deserve. So many that have been left mourning the loss of a loved one. And today we see the serious costs to our finances and economy created by the worst fourth wave in Canada. The worst job numbers, the worst death rate in Canada. And hundreds of millions of dollars more because this government lacked the courage to act. All this could have been avoided. Does the finance minister regret not acting sooner to get COVID under control, to save lives, to prevent damage to our public finances, and to allow an economic recovery that people need and deserve?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I hardly know where to start with the misinformation in that member's preamble talking about the economy. The fact of the matter is this, Mr. Speaker, the economy is moving forward in an extremely strong way, and that was reflected in the revenue forecast, or the revenue numbers in the Q2 report today, Mr. Speaker. In addition to that, seeing as we have the Saskatchewan Construction Association, good folks here in the gallery today, let's talk about construction, who was actually predicting imminent doom in that sector. For years, Mr. Speaker, he stood up and said that. What's happened during COVID, Mr. Speaker? We have seen over the course of the last year 3,500 new jobs in the construction sector alone. 1,100 new jobs in the construction sector over the last month. Investment in building construction, 7.2% increased over August of 2021, $269 million value of those investments. Mr. Speaker, year over year, September to September 20 to 21, building permits increased 45%. Once again, Mr. Speaker, completely wrong.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Fairview.
That's pretty rich coming from a government that added PST onto our construction labor in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Corrections and Policing introduced Bill 70 last week. We saw it for the first time on Tuesday. She spoke to the media 3 days in a row, but she couldn't answer simple questions about the bill. She said, quote, "I come in with my piece of paper and my bill. I read what I'm supposed to read." So, Mr. Speaker, if the Minister for Corrections and Policing can't offer any explanation for this bill, can the government House Leader?
Recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do indeed live in an ever-changing society and world. And when it comes to security risks, specifically speaking of security risks, including here at the Legislative Building and the Legislative Grounds, Mr. Speaker, that is why we have begun the process of looking at ways we can increase the overall security of the Legislative Building and improve existing services, Mr. Speaker. The first step in doing so is to amend the legislation to separate the parliamentary and the security roles of the current position. Separating these roles allows this position to access the broad policing network which is available through the ministry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
We've heard these lines already. It feels like Groundhog Day around here, Mr. Speaker. The media asked several times last week for the government House Leader to speak to Bill 70. He signed the notice for the bill, and we all know that he's the one who's calling the shots on this on the government side. Why won't he find his feet to defend this unprecedented power grab?
Recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To respect the privacy of individuals who have faced security incidents in this building, we obviously are not going into specifics. Elected and unelected officials, as well as staff, have all encountered threatening behaviours and incidences over the last number of years, Mr. Speaker. To diminish the lived experiences of those impacted by these incidents is incredibly disappointing by the opposition, Mr. Speaker. We take security very, very seriously, Mr. Speaker, and I think our record, Mr. Speaker, speaks to our ability to address issues and concerns, whether it's here in the building or whether it's in rural Saskatchewan or urban Saskatchewan. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we funded over the RCMP for over $45 million, Mr. Speaker, invested $103 million to fund 133 frontline municipal policing positions. Mr. Speaker, I'll sit.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Mr. Speaker, he's happy to find his feet to spin the numbers, but not to talk about this bill. The Minister for Corrections and Policing can't provide any answers for Bill 70. The government House Leader, who is obviously the architect, can't seem to speak to it either. Just last week, he was waxing on about the importance, the need to keep the roles of the executive and legislative branches separate, about how that's foundational to our Westminster system. Why won't he take his place, defend his bill that throws this essential separation out the window?
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
This side of the House, Mr. Speaker, has worked consistently and repeatedly with all sides on how we can improve security services at the legislative building, Mr. Speaker, over the past number of years, Mr. Speaker. Ultimately, many of the barriers to improving service can only be addressed through amending legislation, Mr. Speaker. These changes, Mr. Speaker, will provide access to additional resources that will allow for improvement of security within the building and beyond its walls, Mr. Speaker. We will continue to work together with all sides as we strive to improve security services in this building. The legislation that was introduced is an important step towards improving security for all on the legislative grounds. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
A minister needs a new binder. That's completely untrue, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the details about legislative security are not in the bill. Who will do it, what it will look like, how much it'll cost, why it's needed. None of those questions have been answered. We don't even know who's going to be closing the door when members get called in for a vote, Mr. Speaker. We're told we'll know more once the bill passes. But, Mr. Speaker, just trust us isn't good enough for the legislative security in the people's legislature. Why won't they do the right thing, scrap Bill 70, and bring this issue to BOIE where it belongs?
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when we introduced the initiative with respect to bringing environment officers and bringing highway patrol officers under the umbrella of government, albeit they're still responsible for their mandate, we did that, Mr. Speaker, for a very specific reason, and that is to improve and increase security in the province of Saskatchewan with respect to public safety, Mr. Speaker. This concept here that with the legislation that was introduced is exactly the same thing, Mr. Speaker. It is about breaking down the silos that the security service in this building and beyond its walls requires, Mr. Speaker. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, all of which can be provided and assisted in by the ministry, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue having conversations with the members opposite if they so choose, and we'll continue to ensure that people of Saskatchewan are protected in this building.
Recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. During a question period, the opposition House Leader insinuated that the minister was untruthful. I believe she used the words completely untrue. Obviously, that is unparliamentary. That member knows that. I would call on her to stand in her place, withdraw, and apologize.
Recognize the opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, if that isn't the pot calling the kettle black, no. This minister used the phrase misinformation. The minister, when he responded to his question today, used the phrase misinformation. The point of order is not well taken, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I will take it under advisement. Ministerial statements, introduction of bills, presenting reports by standing and special committees, orders of the day.
To number 9, asked by Ms. Wilson.
Recognize the government whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to table the answers to questions 9 and 10.
Questions 9 and 10 have been tabled. Government motions.
Item number 1, the Honourable Mr. Wyatt.
I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to introduce a resolution to amend the Constitution of Canada to repeal Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act. Following my remarks, Mr. Speaker, I'll move the resolution. Mr. Speaker, the federal parliament created the government of Saskatchewan in 1905 by enacting the Saskatchewan Act. Section 24 of that act refers to a tax exemption that the federal government of the day had negotiated with the founders of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. As members of this House are likely aware, CPR is suing the government of Saskatchewan for $341 million, claiming a broad tax exemption under Section 24. That matter is currently before the court. Out of respect for the independence of the courts, I do not intend to make any comments on that litigation. However, as a matter of this Assembly's legislative authority, the government believes it's time to repeal Section 24, regardless of whether it's in force or not. Section 24 is a relic of an earlier time, when Saskatchewan was not treated as an equal partner in Confederation. Limitations on the province of Saskatchewan, such as enacting Section 24 and reserving control of the natural resources for the federal government, are evidence of that. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution was amended in 1930 to transfer the natural resources from Ottawa to Saskatchewan. Repealing Section 24 is another step to ensuring Saskatchewan's autonomy and cementing its place as a truly equal partner in Confederation. If the tax exemption remains in force, Mr. Speaker, it creates a substantial inequity within the province. Simply put, it would not be fair for one of Canada's largest business corporations to have a substantial tax exemption in our province, but be required to pay taxes in other provinces simply based on the date Saskatchewan became a province. As a matter of tax policy and business competitiveness, there must be a level playing field for all businesses. All businesses should pay their fair share of taxes. If the CPR is entitled to this tax exemption, that means other business companies will have to pay extra taxes. Other transportation companies who pay their taxes would be at a significant competitive disadvantage with the CPR. Small businesses who pay their taxes will have to pay more because one of Canada's largest business companies does not pay its fair share. Mr. Speaker, the tax burden will also fall on individuals in Saskatchewan who pay their taxes. The average citizen in this province does pay their taxes. Single parents, retired individuals, young people just starting out, they all pay their fair share. Their tax burden will be increased if the Canadian Pacific Railway Company does not. Mr. Speaker, it's our view that the Canadian Pacific Railway Company agreed in 1966 that it would forego the tax exemption in exchange for regulatory changes made by the federal government. The federal government upheld its end of the agreement by making those regulatory changes, which provided significant benefits to the CPR. It's now time to ensure that our Constitution reflects that reality. The tax exemption no longer has the effect of the agreement reached in 1966 between the federal government and the railway. This is important to ensure that our province and the people who live in it are fairly treated. This change will affirm Saskatchewan's autonomy and ensure that we are treated as equals among Canadian provinces. Mr. Speaker, the French version of this resolution, equally authoritative, is printed on the order paper, and I similarly adopt that French version, as the Saskatchewan Act is a bilingual statute and the proposed amendment is bilingual. I therefore move the following resolution for the benefits of the people of Saskatchewan. Whereas on October 21st, 1880, the Government of Canada entered into a contract with the Canadian Pacific Railway Syndicate for the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And whereas by Clause 16 of the 1880 Canadian Pacific Railway contract, the federal government agreed to give a tax exemption to the Canadian Pacific Railway Company. Whereas in 1905, the Parliament of Canada passed the Saskatchewan Act, which created the province of Saskatchewan. And whereas Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act refers to Clause 16 of the 1880 Canadian Pacific Railway contract, and whereas the Canadian Pacific Railway was completed on August 6, 1885, with the last spike at Craigellachie, and has been operating as a going concern for 136 years. And whereas the Canadian Pacific Railway Company has paid applicable taxes to the Government of Saskatchewan since the province was established in 1905, and whereas it would be unfair to the residents of Saskatchewan if a major corporation were exempt from certain provincial taxes, casting the tax burden onto the residents of Saskatchewan. And whereas it would be unfair to other businesses operating in Saskatchewan, including small businesses, if a major corporation were exempt from certain provincial taxes, given that corporation has a significant competitive advantage over those other businesses to the detriment of farmers, consumers, and producers in the province. And whereas it would not be consistent with Saskatchewan's position as an equal partner in Confederation if there were restrictions on its taxing power that do not apply to other provinces. And whereas on October 29, 1966, the then president of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company, Ian D. Sinclair, advised the then federal Minister of Transport, Jack Pickersgill, that the board of the Canadian Pacific Railway Company had no objection to the constitutional amendments to eliminate the tax exemption. And whereas Section 43 of the Constitution Act 1982 now gives the Legislative Assembly the power to initiate constitutional amendments in relation to the Saskatchewan Act. Now therefore it be resolved by the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan that the Constitution of Canada be amended as follows. Amendment to the Constitution of Canada. 1. Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act is repealed. 2. Repeal of Section 24 is deemed to have been made on August 29, 1966 and is retroactive to that date. Citation. This amendment may be cited as the Constitution Amendment, Year of Proclamation, Saskatchewan Act. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Will the House take the motion as read? I recognize a member from Regina Rosemont.
Mr. Speaker, it's a real honor to rise today on behalf of the official opposition to speak in support of this motion. This is an important action for us as a province, and it represents history in the making, because if this motion succeeds, it would be the first time the Saskatchewan Act and our Constitution has been amended with a motion that originates from the Saskatchewan legislature. This fall, the member for Douglas Park, the critic for justice, and I, as the critic for finance, wrote the Ministers of Justice and Finance, respectively, to invite a meeting with them to discuss the repeal of Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act. We wrote, we would like to meet with the two of you to discuss repealing Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act 1905 to address a jurisdictional inequality for Saskatchewan as a province in the Federation within the Constitution and to ensure clarity with respect to taxation of the Canadian Pacific Railway. We're ready to engage constructively on this matter and look forward to meeting. And here we are, Mr. Speaker. We've met, and indeed, we're pleased to work constructively with government members on this front and to send a united message of the Saskatchewan legislature to Ottawa. The ministers have shared with us that, like us, they too have been assessing this action for a few years. On our end, as the official opposition and as finance critic, I want to thank constitutional experts and leaders, Dr. Howard Leeson and Ms. Marilee Rasmussen, for the research support, and draft amendment that they provided us on this front. Both these leaders have played pivotal roles for Saskatchewan in past constitutional discussions. Dr. Howard Leeson was the chief civil servant leading the discussions and negotiations for Saskatchewan that led to the patriation of Canada's Constitution in 1982. Ms. Marilee Rasmussen, a lawyer and former counsel to this legislature, was intimately involved in the constitutional discussions of 1992 for Saskatchewan. I also certainly want to thank and recognize the strong and respected constitutional team at the Ministry of Justice for their work and expertise with respect to this motion. The motion before us is important and straightforward. In matters of taxation, we believe that Saskatchewan should be treated equally with the original provinces established in 1867, the founding provinces. At present, Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act purports to limit Saskatchewan's powers of taxation in a manner that does not apply to other provinces in the Canadian Federation. The amendment proposed to the Constitution of Canada provides a mechanism to remove this inequality of treatment. The motion relates to matters referred to in Section 43 of the Constitution Act 1982, and therefore requires authorizing resolutions from only the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan, the House of Commons, and the Senate. Therefore, this motion that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan amend the Saskatchewan Act 1905 by repealing Section 24 is a required and important action. This will address the unfairness of the inequality to Saskatchewan as a province in the Federation relating to the purported powers of taxation within our Constitution on this front. The elimination of this jurisdictional inequity is important. It's about fair treatment of Saskatchewan within the Federation. And it's about ensuring clarity regarding the taxation of a large corporation, the CPR, and fairness for Saskatchewan people and businesses. This is why, as the official opposition Saskatchewan New Democrats, we've called for the repeal of Section 24 of the Saskatchewan Act 1905, and why we are proud to stand united as a legislature to send this motion for approval to Ottawa, the House of Commons, and the Senate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Calling the members. All those in favor of the motion, please stand.
Mr. Moe?
Yes.
Mr. McMorris?
Yes.
Ms. Harpower?
Yes.
Mr. Morgan? Yes. Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Mr. Wyant?
Yes.
Ms. Tell?
Yes.
Mr. Bradshaw?
Yes.
Ms. Ayr?
Yes.
Mr. Harrison Meadow Lake?
Yes.
Mr. Merriman?
Yes.
Mr. Henley?
Yes.
Mr. Kading?
Yes.
Mr. Shovel-Dayoff?
Yes.
Mr. Doherty?
Yes.
Mr. Merritt?
Yes.
Mr. Makowski?
Yes.
Ms. Carr?
Yes.
Ms. Ross Regina Rochdale?
Yes.
Mr. Stewart?
Yes.
Mr. Cockrill?
Yes.
Mr. McLeod?
Yes.
Mr. Fayez?
Yes.
Ms. Young Lloyd-Minster?
Yes.
Mr. Hargrave?
Yes.
Mr. Ottenbright?
Yes.
Mr. Graywall?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Mr. Scorpad?
Yes.
Mr. Jensen?
Yes.
Mr. Kiesig?
Yes.
Ms. Ross, Prince Albert Northcote?
Yes.
Mr. Myers?
Yes.
Mr. Dennis?
Yes.
Mr. Buckingham?
Yes.
Mr. Kirsch?
Yes.
Ms. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Gowdy?
Yes.
Mr. Steele?
Yes.
Mr. Francis?
Yes.
Mr. Nerline?
Yes.
Mr. Domitar?
Yes.
Mr. Friesen?
Yes.
Mr. Harrison Cannington?
Yes.
Mr. Miley?
Yes.
Mr. Witherspoon?
Yes.
Ms. Saar?
Yes.
Ms. Mowat?
Yes.
Ms. Young Regina University?
Yes.
Ms. Bowes?
Yes.
Ms. Conway?
Yes.
Ms. Beck?
Yes.
Ms. Nippy Albright?
Yes.
Ms. Ritchie?
Yes.
Mr. Love?
Yes.
All those opposed to the motion, please stand.
Mr. Speaker, those in favor of the motion, 55. Those opposed, nil.
I declare the motion carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ask for leave to make a motion of transmittal.
Leave has been requested to make a motion of transmittal. Leave granted. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would move that and first, thanks for the Assembly's granting of leave. I would move that the Speaker, on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, transmit copies of the resolution just passed to the President of the Privy Council and the Speakers of the House of Commons and Senate of Canada, requesting that the necessary motions be arranged to address this matter in the respective houses as expeditiously as possible. I so move.
The motion reads that the Speaker, on behalf of the Legislative Assembly, transmit copies of the resolution just passed to the President of the Privy Council and the Speakers of the House of Commons and Senate of Canada, requesting that the necessary motions be arranged to address this matter in respective houses as expeditiously as possible. All in favour? Opposed? Carried.
Orders, second readings. Item number 1, the Honourable Ms. Tell to move second reading of Bill number 70, the Legislative Assembly Amendment Act 2021.
I recognize the Minister of Corrections, Policing and Public Safety.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Legislative Assembly Amendment Act of 2021. Members of this Assembly will know that the Legislative Assembly Act of 2007 is foundational legislation through which we, as legislators, set out various roles and responsibilities for ourselves as MLAs in this Assembly. The Act also sets out various duties and functions for the Legislative Assembly service that serves the public and the MLAs in this Assembly as part of the legislative arm of government. Mr. Speaker, we live in a changed and ever-changing world. We have all seen examples of where threats have escalated into violence. This should not happen in any workplace, any place in Saskatchewan, whether it's here or in the legislative building. The safety and security of the legislative building, the staff and visitors is of utmost importance to our government, and we take this responsibility very seriously. We want to ensure that we create the safest environment for employees who work in this building and for those members of the public who come to visit their legislative assembly. It is for this reason that our government is addressing how we enhance the overall security of the legislative building and beyond. Mr. Speaker, this bill proposes changes to Division 3.1 of the Act regarding security in our Legislative Assembly. Mr. Speaker, these changes include amendments to redefine the term legislative precinct in this division to mean the floor of the chamber in the Legislative Assembly, establish a new legislative district consisting of what geographically used to be the legislative precinct, with only the newly defined space of the legislative precinct removed. Create the position of Director of Legislative Security to be appointed by the minister responsible for the Police Act 1990. Assign responsibility for security within the newly defined legislative district to the Director of Legislative Security. Authorize the Director to make cooperative arrangements with the Government of Saskatchewan and the Speaker to meet that responsibility, including the employment or use of any police officer, sheriff, or special constable that may be required by the Director to do so. Confirm the existing security-related jurisdiction and responsibilities of the Speaker, Sergeant-at-Arms, and the Legislative Protective Service within the newly defined legislative precinct. Authorize the Speaker to make cooperative arrangements with the Government of Saskatchewan to meet that responsibility and restrict the possession of weapons in both the legislative district and the legislative precincts to authorized individuals. Our government is committed to the safety of this building, its staff, and visiting members of the public. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Legislative Assembly Amendment Act of 2021.
It has been moved that Bill 7 to be now read a second time. Is Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to rise in my feet to provide some comments and context with respect to Bill 70. I know we've had the opportunity to speak about this bill a few times in question period, but we haven't had the opportunity to provide a full context of this legislation. And I think it's really important, especially since I've been spending a lot of time hearing the minister talk about this in question period, talk about it to media, and I heard her speak about it on the Gormley Show on Friday. I think there's a lot of context that's missing and a lot of things that are being misconstrued that need to be rightened out, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important for government members in particular to fully understand what they are agreeing to when they're supporting this bill, because it's a big deal. This isn't just the opposition, being in opposition and waving red flags when there isn't red flags. This is a big deal, and this is hugely concerning, and it's unprecedented, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's important to start with some historical context of how we got to where we are with the Sergeant-at-Arms office today. Mr. Speaker, up until about 1985 in Saskatchewan, the Sergeant-at-Arms was responsible for the chamber and the galleries only. executive government had responsibility for security of the building through the ministry. I believe one of the ministries, as well as the Wascana Centre Authority, had some control. Now, obviously, I wasn't here in 1985 for these discussions, but I have had the opportunity to speak with individuals who were at that table, who made those decisions. Mr. Speaker, under the direction of Speaker Herb Swan, who was a progressive conservative member from Rosetown Elrose, there was an all-party decision at that time to move security from under the executive to under the Speaker. In addition to that, the management of the funding then was moved from under the executive, from under the council, to the BOIE. Now, why was that decision made at that time, Mr. Speaker? There were a lot of concerns about, first of all, who was making decisions about who had access to this building. There were a lot of concerns about cabinet directing security decisions. There were concerns around demonstrations that were occurring in this building, Mr. Speaker. And there were concerns about executive directing security of members' offices, because as we all know, the Sergeant-at-Arms is responsible for also ensuring that we have security in our respective constituency offices. Mr. Speaker, that was met, like I said, with this change. It was successful, and through the all-party agreement, they were able to do things like ban indoor demonstrations. We don't see indoor demonstrations today, Mr. Speaker, and why is that? Because we all came together as a legislature, all parties came to the table and all decided to do that, and everyone was able to do that under the comfort of knowing that all decisions around security were under the direction of the Speaker, an independent member of this legislature. Mr. Speaker, as you know, the Speaker has a constitutional duty to defend the privileges of the legislature and its members. It's a very important role that they have. Now, this change happened in 1985, but you won't actually find any legislation that speaks to it until about 2005, because, like I said, it was a gentleman's agreement. It was an agreement between all sides that this was what was going to happen. Everyone was supportive of that. In 2005, you'll see it was added to the legislation, and I had it in front of me, and now I'm missing it. The legislation speaks very, very briefly to the role of the Sergeant-at-Arms, but it does essentially, I can't find it in front of me, but it does specifically say the Sergeant-at-Arms has the authority under the direction of the Speaker, to manage security of the legislative building and the surrounding grounds. Now, Mr. Speaker, that was relatively successful from my understanding. You don't see a lot of discussion about it until very recently, in 2019, there was a change to the Legislative Assembly Act 2007, Mr. Speaker. In 2019, there was a decision, an all-party decision, that there was a need to better define what the legislative precinct is. So in the current legislation, you'll see the amendment that we made in 2019 that very specifically defines what the legislative precinct is. And you'll find it in 76.1. It states legislative precinct means A, the legislative building, and B, the parcel of land in the City of Regina located within the boundaries commencing at the inside northwest corner of Legislative Drive and Memorial Way, thence easterly on the southern curb of Legislative Drive to the inside corner of Legislative Drive and Avenue A, then southerly and westerly following Avenue A along the curve on the inside curb of Avenue A until Avenue A intersects with Memorial Way, thence northerly on the inside curb of Memorial Way until the point of commencement, being the inside northwest corner of Legislative Drive and Memorial Way. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation, if you'll see from Hansard, it was introduced and passed all in one day. Why did that occur? Because there was discussions on both sides. There was an agreement on both sides. There was an understanding that this is what needed to be done to ensure that security was being met with in an appropriate way. Mr. Speaker, you don't see that in this legislation. And I think that's very telling. I think that tells a story in and of itself. Now, the bill today before us, it takes that definition of legislative precinct and it changes it. It changes it to just mean the floor of this assembly. That's it. Not the galleries, not the hallways, not the caucus offices, not the members' lounges, not the front door, not the steps, just this floor. That's it. The Sergeant of Arms will be responsible for security here. That's it. This change is turning the Sergeant at Arms office into a ceremonial role only. In the place of the Sergeant at Arms, for the remainder of that definition that I gave you earlier, will be, how is that defined? A Director of Legislative Security. How is that person appointed? It lays it out pretty clear in Bill 70. 76.2 sub 1. The member of Executive Council responsible for the administration of the Police Act 1990 shall appoint a Director of Legislative Security. That individual will be responsible for security, like I said, everywhere except for this chamber. So not only are we going back to 1985, we're actually going worse than we were in 1985, because at least the Sergeant at Arms was responsible for the galleries. I think it's really important that we talk about exactly what this legislation means. And there's no spin in that. That is just me reading the previous legislation and reading the bill and trying to explain to everyone exactly what this says. Mr. Speaker, it's long-standing parliamentary custom, not just here, but in many Commonwealth jurisdictions, in many provinces as well in this country, that Parliament is protected through the Speaker. And they do that, and the Speaker does that protection through the work of the Sergeant at Arms. Like I said, the Speaker has a constitutional duty to defend the privileges of the Parliament and its members. Mr. Speaker, and this has worked very effectively in Saskatchewan for decades. Whenever there were concerns about security issues, whether there were issues about what we needed, do we need to better fund security, what are the next steps, any sort of breaches, they came to BOIE, they were discussed in camera. If you're ever looking for anything in Hansard for security issues, you will find it in the BOIE. Often you'll find those conversations in camera. And through the decades, through this independent office of the Speaker, there have been several independent security reviews where there's been a blanket look to see, okay, what needs to happen here? Are there improvements that need to be made? What changes need to happen? One incident that precipitated a security review here was actually the attack on the Parliament of Canada in Ottawa in October of 2014. After that attack, BOIE undertook a security review under the direction of the Speaker. There were actually, I believe, 2 reviews that happened, 2 reports. Mr. Speaker, you won't actually find the reviews in Hansard, but everybody here has a representative on BOIE for them, and they can ask to get a copy of that and see what's actually requested for improvements in those reviews. I will tell you this right now, there are no recommendations in those reviews that security should move under the government responsibility and away from the Sergeant at Arms. There are other recommendations that still haven't been implemented that could be implemented easily through the BOIE, but none of them include changing the Sergeant at Arms jurisdiction. And Mr. Speaker, going back to that attack on 2014, we all know that the hero from that incident Kevin Vickers, was the one who shot and killed the terrorist that entered the building. He was the sergeant at arms there. When their House of Commons did a review after that attack, I'll tell you what, Mr. Speaker, they didn't do. They didn't reduce Mr. Vickers' responsibility. They didn't reduce his jurisdiction. To say this is an overreach, Mr. Speaker, is an understatement. To say it is an offense and affront to those who work, to the Sergeant at Arms and those who work with the Sergeant at Arms, is an understatement. Mr. Speaker, these individuals come to work every single day willing to take a bullet for each and every one of us. Each and every one of us. As has always been the case, if there are issues with needing to expand security in this building, that is easily and quickly doable through the BOIE, because guess what? BOIE controls the purse strings. We can enhance the funding. We can add more people by providing the Sergeant at Arms office with more money, if that's what the issue is. I'm trying to think of a parliamentary way to say I can't buy this siloing argument when I know, and I have seen with my own two eyes, how effectively the Sergeant at Arms office has worked with RCMP, who are in this building every single day, the Regina Police Service, who come out here and assist the Sergeant at Arms office whenever there are issues with demonstrations. And I can tell you, for government members who perhaps park in the back or maybe have been able to avoid walking through any of the protests lately, you know, the protests aren't fun necessarily. We were at a protest this summer. I can't remember if it was about wanting to increase restrictions. It was wanting to maybe a mask mandate protest. Right. It was a group of perhaps parents, I think. And we were here on the opposition side to speak with these individuals. And joined with them was a counter-protest. There was probably about 20 anti-maskers who were counter-protesting. And me and my Regina colleagues and the Leader of the Opposition were all there. And who was there between us? About, I don't know, 10, 12 Regina Police Service members. The Sergeant at Arms office was there. You know, it was uncomfortable, but I felt safe. And if there are any security concerns, if there have been any threats made to this building, to members of this assembly that have not been shared in the appropriate way that they're shared, which is through the Sergeant at Arms office, which is how we become aware of any threats. If they have not been shared through the appropriate channels, shame on you. Because like I said before, I bring my child into this building. I've walked through those anti-mask protesters with my 4-week-old child in my arms. The member for Regina University had her child here this afternoon. So if there are legitimate threats that haven't been shared with the Sergeant at Arms office, that are therefore not being shared with us, that aren't being discussed at the BOIE table in camera because we're not having BOIE meetings, we're discussing this at the floor of the legislature for some reason. Shame on every single one of you. It brings me back to what is the need for this change? Why are we here? Why are we having this bill in front of us? The minister keeps saying, well, it's the start. We put this forward as the start of our conversation about how we're going to increase security in the legislature during these unprecedented times. Mr. Speaker, tabling a bill at the start of a conversation is like walking into a negotiation with a grenade with the pin pulled. That's not how you have conversations. That's how you start discussions. You've already blown the thing up. Conversations happen at the BOIE table, in camera. I know there are many members on both sides who've had experiences at the BOIE table. When I was looking through Hansard, when budgets were being discussed, I saw, the health minister's been there, the education minister's been there, government relations minister has been there, government house leader has been there. They understand how these conversations happen. The Minister for Status of Women, she's been there. You should understand the importance of that table, the importance of being able to have those conversations in camera, and what negotiations really look like. This isn't negotiating. This is blowing things up right from the beginning. And like I said already, if security needs to be expanded, if there are imminent threats, there is nothing more dangerous than just deciding you're going to start from scratch. You know what makes a lot more sense? Going to the table, going to BOIE, and having a conversation about what we can be doing better. Looking at the 2014 review that hasn't even been fully implemented yet, and deciding what we can be doing today to improve security. This is not that, and it leads me to wonder, what is the real reason we are doing this? Is government mad about the protesters we're seeing outside? If that's the case, then where are we going next? What's the next step here? Is there the hope that this new security body will be able to arrest and disperse these protesters, these individuals who we've already said should not be protesting at hospitals, should not be protesting at schools, and they shouldn't. They should be protesting here, lawfully, peacefully, which I'll tell you, I trust the Sergeant-at-Arms office, who have decades of policing experience, who understand the values of de-escalating conflict, who understand the balance between unlawful activity and charter rights, and have done, I would say, a pretty darn good job of keeping us safe. So what's the next step? Are we going to have this new security force arrest and disperse protesters? And then what's going to happen with those charges? Are they going to go to the courts and then get thrown out? They're going to get thrown out because they're unlawful, because the individuals who are serving us now understand what is a lawful arrest and an unlawful arrest. And I hope that the Justice Minister and the previous Justice Minister really think about that and really worry about what these next steps will be and what this will look like. Mr. Speaker, security of this building is for everyone, regardless of political stripes, regardless of who is in government, and like I said, belong under the independence of the Speaker and should be discussed always in a non-partisan way. This is how it's always been dealt with, and it has been done this way effectively. We have not been trying to block any attempts to increase the budget of the Sergeant-at-Arms. We've always worked very collaboratively in these discussions. Mr. Speaker, the minister said in media she believes that, quote, "We believe that definite organization and structure with respect to security is required," end quote. Mr. Speaker, I asked the minister why she thinks that doesn't already exist, why she thinks what exists in Parliament, in the House of Commons in Ottawa, where they've had a terrorist attack, isn't good enough for what's here. Mr. Speaker, I also wonder, like I said, the Sergeant-at-Arms office has done a very good job working effectively with the RCMP, with the Regina Police Service, and the PCC as well, Mr. Speaker, and I wonder if any of those stakeholders have been consulted on this change. I wonder, has anyone thought to ask Regina Police Service what they think about this change? Mr. Speaker, it frustrates me that we're here today, that we're having this discussion. It frustrates me that this legislation has been brought to the floor of the Assembly. I hate to have to talk about these roles in this public way. Let me be clear one more time. We do not support the changes in this legislation. Not only is it a complete breach of tradition in how issues of security of this building have been handled in the past, like I said, in a non-partisan, collaborative way through the BOIE, it is an insult to the good work that the Office of the Sergeant-at-Arms has been providing and is currently providing to each and every one of us every single day. Mr. Speaker, if this is good enough for Ottawa, it's good enough for us. If Kevin Vickers was hailed as a hero, we should afford the same respect to our Sergeant-at-Arms. I hope the government members think about this legislation, have a conversation, do the right thing, pull this bill, bring these discussions to the BOIE. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared now to move adjournment on the debate on Bill 70.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second readings. Item number 2. The Honourable Mr. Wyant to move second reading of Bill number 71, the Insurance Amendment Act 2021.
Recognize the Minister CIC.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Insurance Amendment Act 2021. This bill amends the Insurance Act to codify a recent Court of Appeal decision respecting the limit on the amount of funds that can be held in side accounts for life insurance policies. Mr. Speaker, a side account is an account associated with a life insurance policy that can be used to hold funds to pay future costs of insurance, premium taxes, and other administrative fees or charges for the life insurance policy. In 2018, the regulations under the former Saskatchewan Insurance Act were amended to implement a limit on the amount of funds that can be held in a side account. The equivalent section was also inserted into the regulations under the new Insurance Act when that Act came into force in 2020. Mr. Speaker, investors have challenged the application of this limit to existing contracts of insurance. In 2020, the Court of Queen's Bench held that the limit in the regulations only applies on a go-forward basis to life insurance contracts that were entered into after the regulations were amended in 2018. In early 2021, the Court of Appeal reversed that decision and held that the limit in the regulations applies to all existing life insurance contracts, including those contracts that were entered into before 2018. Earlier this month, the Supreme Court of Canada denied leave to appeal this Court of Appeal decision. Mr. Speaker, limiting the amount of money that can be deposited in the side accounts associated with life insurance contracts protects both insurers and consumers. Insurance companies are not regulated for deposit taking, and being forced to accept unlimited deposits could threaten their financial stability. If an insurer fails, consumers holding that insurer's policies may not receive the insurance company coverage that they have been paying for and rely on receiving. This amendment will codify the Court of Appeal's decision on the application of the limit to existing contracts of life insurance and will ensure that side accounts continue to be used in the manner in which they were initially intended to operate. Mr. Speaker, the amendments will also bring Saskatchewan's Act in line with other acts of other provinces that have implemented similar limits on side account deposits since Saskatchewan first imposed the limit in 2018. Mr. Speaker, it's my privilege to move second reading of the Insurance Amendment Act 2021.
It has been moved that Bill number 71 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter in the debate on Bill number 71. Mr. Speaker, obviously insurance is important to a lot of people, in particular the nuances of various provisions. As such, we are going to be reaching out to stakeholders to gather feedback on this legislative change to ensure that it meets the needs of Saskatchewan residents. In order to facilitate that work, Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill number 71.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, second readings. Item number 3, the Honourable Mr. Wyant to move second reading of Bill number 72, the Life Leases Act.
Recognize the Minister of CIC.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to move second reading of the Life Leases Act. This legislation was recommended by the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan, who considered this topic at the request of the former Minister of Justice and Attorney General. A fine person, I might say. This new legislation codifies many of the best practices which have been implemented in the life lease industry in Saskatchewan. A life lease is a lease agreement which provides the leaseholder with the right of occupancy of the rental unit for life or a fixed term of not less than 20 years. Life leases also require a large initial payment called an entrance fee to be made to a lease operator. Mr. Speaker, presently life leases are for the most part unregulated in Saskatchewan. The majority of life leases are held by senior citizens. This bill will create a framework of minimum standards that apply to lease operators and those entering into life leases. Mr. Speaker, this bill will not prevent lease operators and leaseholders from entering into life lease agreements. Lease operators and leaseholders will retain the ability to enter into terms more stringent than the bill provides, or have provisions in life leases that are not contemplated in the bill, as long as these provisions do not contradict the bill. Under the bill, a lease operator will be required to disclose entrance fees and other financial obligations to potential leaseholders before a life lease is executed. This will allow leaseholders to understand their financial obligations before they sign the life lease agreement. Mr. Speaker, this bill will require that terms be set out in each life lease respecting whether the life lease can be assigned to a subsequent leaseholder. A leaseholder will have 10 days after the life lease or an assignment of life lease is executed to cancel the life lease or assignment for any reason. The bill will require lease operators to establish a reserve fund, which will be used for repairs to the residential complex. Mr. Speaker, a key provision in this Act is that a refund fund must be established by lease operators if some or all of the entrance fees are refundable. This refund fund will help protect the investments made by leaseholders in a residential complex. If a residential complex is under development, a trustee will hold the funds paid by leaseholders until certain requirements are met. Mr. Speaker, to ensure engagement and transparency for leaseholders, an annual meeting of the leaseholders will be established. Additionally, leaseholders will be able to send representatives to attend meetings of the lease operators' owners. Lastly, the Act will introduce offences and penalties for contraventions of the Act or regulations. People may also be liable where they make false or misleading statements to prospective leaseholders. Mr. Speaker, this bill, as recommended by the Law Reform Commission of Saskatchewan, carefully balances consumer protections while also allowing for flexibility in life leases and freedom of contract. Saskatchewan has many innovative housing options available to meet the variety of needs of our residents. This legislation will continue to foster further innovation in the Saskatchewan housing market. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to move second reading of the Life Leases Act.
It has been moved that Bill number 72 be now read a second time. Is the Assembly ready for the question? I recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise today and enter into the debate on Bill number 72. Now, this is actually an issue that came to my attention shortly after I was elected in 2016. I had a building, seniors residence at the time, that most of the residents had life leases, Mr. Speaker, and they were frustrated because they didn't really have an avenue of any sort of dispute mechanism avenue similar to those who are renting, for example. They weren't, like a condo board either. They were sort of their own beast, and there wasn't any, as the minister mentioned, there wasn't any regulation in this area in the province. Like the minister mentioned, the former Minister of Justice, the current Minister for Labour, recommended that this legislation or that this issue be considered at the Law Reform Commission. It was actually a conversation that he and I had about that, and the Law Reform Commission came back with a report, a very well done report, that recommended that legislation be produced in this area. Very happy to see that move forward now into the fruition of this legislation. I haven't had the opportunity yet to look at all the details of the legislation, but I do know that it's still an issue in Saskatchewan. There are still many individuals who are signing life leases. Mr. Speaker, actually, I just learned the other day that my grandmother-in-law has signed a life lease. So it's an issue that's important to a lot of people in this province. We want to make sure that there are safeties in place and security in place for individuals who sign these leases. Like the minister said, that there are appropriate minimum standards and that there is a dispute and resolution mechanism. We'll be looking through this legislation very closely. Like I said, it's very important to make sure that we get this right. In order to facilitate that work and to reach out to stakeholders, I'm now prepared to adjourn debate on this bill.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 38, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Lowe.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into adjourned debates today on Bill number 38, the Seizure of Criminal Property Amendment Act of 2021. There are a number of different changes that are being proposed here, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's a new section that gives the Director of Civil Forfeiture additional powers to make preliminary orders, and this is around the preservation of property, disclosure, and investigations. This is something we need to take a close look at to understand a little bit more about why more powers for investigation are necessary, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I heard someone, one of the members, joking that we shouldn't take a closer look at it, which makes me think that maybe we should, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So yeah, there are questions around who's asking for this change, as well as what stakeholders have to say about it. And I also wonder what other jurisdictions are doing here, and if this legislation puts us in line with what the other provinces are up to lately. I'm not the critic on this file, so I don't have that information at the top of my mind, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But it's something we should take a look at. The bill also requires financial institutions to disclose certain information about a person's property or assets if it is suspected that these were attained through the proceeds of crime. Again, I wonder, how necessary this change is, what the barriers are to the current systems that we have in place, and why this would be required. And then there are new offense provisions for people that fail to disclose or mislead the director. So we will definitely be taking a look at how these amendments impact people of limited means. The minister has noted that the purpose is to combat money laundering, and this isn't something that we hear a lot about across the province. So I think learning about the incidence of this type of crime and how widespread it is, certainly it makes sense that the property and assets would be tied to that, because we were talking about, you know, some organized crime here where criminals would have the ability to make large amounts of money. So I think, you know, these are important things to investigate, and we obviously want to see crime, the incidence of crime, to decrease in Saskatchewan. I think we all agree on that front. And I think it's just a question at this point about whether these provisions will lead to that decrease, and whether they're going to be effective in combating money laundering. So we will make sure that there is extensive consultation with stakeholders with this bill, and I know that my colleagues will have more that they want to weigh in on, and the critic in committee as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 38 for today.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 39, the Queen's Printer Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Loeb.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Fairview.
Well, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to enter into adjourn debates on Bill number 39 as well, the Queen's Printer Amendment Act of 2021. This act is primarily meaning to change the process for publication of the Saskatchewan Gazette, which is the official publication of the Queen's Printer, to make it electronic, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It requires that a paper publication of the Gazette be published not less than twice a month currently, and the delay to print and mail the Gazette will now be waived, making it accessible online, although print will still be available. And I think that's important, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We have varying levels of technological prowess across our province. You know, I at one point sort of considered myself to be a technological Luddite, and now learning comparatively that I do adopt use of technology at a somewhat faster pace than many of my colleagues as well, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it, I think, is in no small part to my partner, Grayson, who follows electronics and technology very closely. He is always looking at the next phones that are available, and, you know, it's silly because I think his phone is like 4 years old, but he likes to know what's out there. He's always talking about what the latest thing is with the Consumer Electronics Show, and following, you know, electric vehicles and all kinds of advances. I think most of our light switches are smart light switches and that sort of thing, which sounds good in theory until the Wi-Fi stops working or something of that sort. So, you know, we know that we need to adjust with the times, but sometimes it feels like technology advances at such a rapid pace nowadays. And so I'm always very interested in pieces of technology that appear in legislation, which sort of enshrines the practice that we currently have, and you know, is something that will necessarily become out of date as technology evolves, which is a tad bit philosophical, I would say, but you know, these types of things get you thinking about the current state of affairs. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there was, I think, you think about when you used to see science fiction shows and some of the things that were portrayed in those shows that seemed so far off, and now, you know, we do have robots that can vacuum for us and these type of things. Well, mine doesn't always know where to vacuum, but kind of bumbles around a little bit. But we're living in different times, and I think it's time that we acknowledge that, and certainly in support of legislation that truly modernizes, and you know, we'll be watching for unintended consequences as well. And we'll definitely want to make sure that the publication is still accessible to everyone who wants to read it. But we're happy to see the Gazette moving from print to online, and I think that is the substance of my remarks on this bill. And with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 39, the Queen's Printer Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 40, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2021 is back.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 40, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2021. Reading this bill, it's focusing on deterring rural property crime, as well as increasing the minimal penalties from $2,000 to $5,000 for first offenders and up to $25,000 for second or repeat offenders on the same property. It also introduces the possibility of imprisonment, maximum of 6 months, and introducing a $200,000 maximum penalty for corporations that counsels or aids in the commission of an offence, and it establishes a statutory tort for trespassing. When I read this, this has come up. This Trespass to Property Amendment Act has been something that has concerned many stakeholders, in particular the Indigenous community. And the changes in this bill do not address the concerns we've had from those stakeholders. And what government should be addressing is basically, why is this happening? You know, not just making the assumption that people are just going out there for the sake of committing crime and so forth. But I just wanted to speak about this as an Indigenous person, as well as an educated Indigenous person that studied political studies as her master's degree. You know, when I think about these bills that we're speaking to and entering in debate on, one of the things that comes up is how often legislation is passed without consulting those that are going to be most impacted. I think of this Trespass to Property Amendment Act. Just on First Nation communities, how many people continually trespass onto our traditional lands, our First Nations? The RCMP are called, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And what happens? They get quietly escorted off the lands. This happens over and over and over again. And our justice system that's out there does do nothing to protect the Indigenous landowners from the offenders. When I think about the justice system and the bills that are being introduced, and I think about this trespassing, I think about a system that is there's justice for different folks. Colton Boucher, when he trespassed onto a farmer's home, he got shot in the head. And the RCMP, what did they do? They discriminated. They went to that young man's mother and treated her horribly. And the man who killed him got off. A week before that happened, I was traveling to a Sundance ceremony out east. In my 2019 truck or 18 truck, whatever year it was, a brand new truck, traveling with my friend, and we got lost. And I was driving around and entering farmers' yards and asking for directions. And I was scared going into those yards because I didn't know what kind of reception I would get. The only saving grace was I had a nice vehicle, and I don't have that accent. And those folks helped me. And a week later, when I heard of Colton Boucher dying, I thought, that could have been me a week before. And when that verdict came out, that man was found not guilty, I was going to go visit my friends who are farmers, and I was scared to go. They said, come to our farm. This is where we live. I was scared to go because I thought, am I also going to get shot for driving into somebody's yard? Years, Indigenous folks, Indigenous communities have reported to the RCMP when non-Indigenous people trespassed onto our lands, and nothing has been done. And what's happened? Because our Indigenous community does not have faith anymore, little faith and trust with the RCMP to protect us. They've stopped reporting these crimes. Because nothing is being done about the trespasser by the RCMP when an Indigenous person makes a complaint. What happens? Those people are escorted off the property. And also, in this legislation here, this bill number 40, there's no section that's devoted to Indigenous land and their use in the Saskatchewan hunting, trapping regulations that are also published. So there's absolutely nothing in here that's talking about how do we protect those Indigenous folks, those Indigenous peoples. In 2019, a man was found trespassing with a gun in his truck after his family had been evicted from the property. The man said he was going to take the crop on the land. The RCMP did nothing except apologize for doing nothing. FSIN has been calling on this government to do more. And again, Colton Boucher murder was a prime example of how RCMP treat First Nations people in trespassing investigation. And I'll say, the RCMP were found to have racially discriminated against Colton's mom. And here's the other thing here that's interesting. There's little to no information out there concerning white settler trespassing on reserve lands. This happens repeatedly. I was shocked in my First Nation community when I was told that one of our traditional users was out on the land just going for a drive, and he came upon some white people driving around on the land. And he asked them, "What are you doing here? Why are you driving here? Who gave you permission to be on this land?" Those individuals said, "Oh, we're just driving around." And here's the other thing. You want to increase penalties? My First Nation, we have bison on our land. We have cameras around our land. And our bison manager catches white people killing our bison. And when he reports it to the RCMP, they do nothing. Nothing. And you all know bison are not cheap. When that happens and the RCMP are not doing anything, that's a problem. Yet there's no problem in going hard on people that are onto property, that are either lost or had, in Colton Boucher's case, going and killing them. You know, I think about how many people, and here's the thing, here, we sit here, and we want to protect the people of this province. And we want to pass bills to protect our citizens here. Yet we don't really give a bleep about the Indigenous peoples and their lands and what they go through. We don't. And nor do we even go and ask them. We don't even engage them in dialogue. We send an email to them and say, here's what we're doing. We don't even take as, I don't know, how many members here actually go and visit their neighboring First Nation communities that they represent. How many actually go there? And have you ever asked them what these laws that you're passing, your government is passing, to say what do they think about that? Have you ever brought those issues into this House to say, hey, I spoke with the neighboring community here. Here's the issues they have on our trespass to Property Amendment Act. Here's the concerns they have. How many have done that? Then bring them to the House here. Let them talk. Give them that opportunity. Instead of just sitting here and turning a blind eye and saying, yep, these are good. When FSIN is addressing these concerns and having to come to the media, and they're supposed to represent Indigenous, the First Nations people in this province, if they're calling the government out on this, and you're not bringing these to the table, there's an issue. You know, this still hasn't come into force here, this Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2021 here. There's concerns that have not been addressed, and yet you want to pass this. There's various stakeholders, First Nations, Métis, farmers that also have questions, and those haven't been addressed. I'm all for being tough on crime, but I'm also for meaningfully consulting in a meaningful way. That is why we have duty to consult. Duty to consult needs to happen in a meaningful way to talk to the people that are going to be impacted by the laws that we pass here in this province. We need their input, because if we don't do it right, it's going to come up and bite us in the rear end. I guess my question here is, this is great to be presenting, but what are we doing to protect the Indigenous landowners here? What are we doing to protect my nation, their bison that are being killed off? And it's all caught on camera here, and the RCMP aren't doing anything. What are we doing? So I ask, and I want this in here recorded, that Indigenous people have been asking, they've been wanting input on this. They have had concerns about this. Please, enough of this falling on deaf ears. We need to start. We need to listen to the stakeholders. Because you know what? It's not just non-Indigenous people that vote for you guys. It's also Indigenous people. Listen to them. Engage them. Ask them how they want to be consulted. Ask them how these proposed legislation we're bringing down, how is it going to impact you? You know, I'm very grateful that I've been educated on in the political studies and understanding, reading of bills and analyzing all of those things. And it's important that we, as leaders, not just accept something at face value, we actually dig into it and ask ourselves, how is this going to impact the people that we serve? And as an elected member, am I doing my job in asking those stakeholders if this is right for them? And if they have questions, am I raising that where it needs to be raised? I've spoken quite passionately about this, and I will, I'm sure the critic has also more questions to ask about this. So what I will do now at this time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is that I will move that the bill to bill number 40, the Trespass to Property Amendment Act 2020, where is it? Yeah, I want to adjourn debate on this bill. Thank you so much. I have a visual disability, so it's hard to see the papers. So, miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Agreed. Carried.
Orders adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021. I've learned a lot in going through this act, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that well, it makes sense. Of course, we have legislation that outlines how we make legislation, and that's what this is, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So it provides some guidelines to standardize how legislation comes about, to standardize some definitions that exist, and that we're all sort of trying to communicate with the other provinces as well to make sure that our legislation matches the legislation that is being enacted across Canada. So it is news to me that this legislation exists, I must admit, but nevertheless, we are here looking at amending it today. And the role that it takes is providing the rules for how Saskatchewan's laws are drafted, how they are interpreted, published, and revised. So it's the full gamut. And the attempt that we're hearing here from the minister is that other provinces had made updates to their legislation acts, and so we are here trying to make similar updates to continue to reflect best practices. So every time I hear the word modernization, I get a little suspect about what the intent is. We're going to be watching to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences of this legislation, and that we are, in fact, just modernizing and reflecting what best practice looks like. Some of the changes here are interpreting how acts apply to one another and defining certain terms that exist. And the minister has claimed that this will allow for more, or that there's also a section that allows for more efficiency in making comprehensive consequential amendments. So this is when many different amendments are being made at the same time. So efficiency sounds good, but we want to make sure that there's not any shortcuts that are being created here when there are multiple amendments at once. So that's something for us to keep an eye on. It's certainly important that we modernize language, and so it seems appropriate to amend this legislation, but I know that my colleagues and the critic will be watching closely to look at some of those details and to consider what the implications are of these changes, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 41, the Legislation Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Orders adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021, number 2. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon, Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's my honor to rise in the Assembly and enter into adjourned debate on Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021. It's been described as another piece of housekeeping legislation, so I came dressed in my typical housekeeping attire, which is exactly how I typically dress when there's much housekeeping to be done. So I have taken time to review the changes that this bill suggests and have a look at the minister's comments, which were just a few lines in Hansard. So it will be my goal to just provide just a little bit more than the minister did, because obviously this bill is aimed at, as he described, housekeeping and modernization, making just some simple changes with things such as replacing references to the Minister of Community, obviously an outdated term, resources and employment with the Minister of Social Services, as well as this amendments to this bill removes reference to repealed legislation, always good to catch that sort of thing, and implements gender-neutral language. And I'll just start there with a couple quick comments. I think this is really important. I voiced my support for this with other pieces of legislation described as modernization and housekeeping. I think replacing older forms of language that maybe reinforced different types of supremacy, or in this case, perhaps patriarchy, I think is important. And so it's good to see gender-neutral language. I think we have to remember that when we use language that reinforces gender binary, there's a lot of folks in the province who don't identify in that way. And what that does, this is always important to ask, what does it do when we use that language? It excludes people. And I think it's incumbent on all members of this House to ensure that the language that we use is inclusive and does not, by design, exclude people who call Saskatchewan home. And so I do support the changes in the language in this bill that bring in gender-neutral language. There are a few other changes in here to things like the Agriculture Administration Act and, of course, changes to the Global Transportation Hub Authority Act. You would think that this government would want their festering dumpster fires to just quietly go away, but alas, here it is again being updated in this bill. So just a reminder of failures of the past continue to haunt this government. You know, I don't think that there's much here that I'm really opposed to, though. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I have taken time to review comments from my colleagues in opposition, and I'll continue to listen as we continue through adjourned debates of this bill. But at this moment, I will suggest that we adjourn debate on Bill number 42, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2021. Thank you.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates. Item 6, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Witherspoon.
I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise to enter into debate on Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021. What a pleasure it is to speak to this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I had the distinct pleasure of growing up just a few minutes from this wonderful museum, which is part of our collective social fabric. It is a beautiful jewel, architectural jewel within the jewel that is our beloved Wascana Park. And it certainly has loomed large in my life and continues to, something I'll get into in a bit more in a moment. I understand that this bill would grant the museum the ability to earn revenue. I think that is key. Right now, I would note that the museum is free for entrance to any, it's a pay what you can. There's a suggested donation, but of course it is completely accessible to the public irrespective of socioeconomic means, which is so key. And so the more we can ensure that the museum is sustainable, the better. My understanding is that this bill will also provide opportunities for researchers to refresh and renew current exhibits, and expand the museum's sort of exhibit options. I know that this is something we all welcome on this side of the House, being that the mandate of the museum is to preserve our shared natural history and objects of historical and ethnological interest. It is so key that this ability be provided under the Act, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I think it's probably rare to speak to a bill about the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. I just want to sort of talk about one reason that this institution loomed so large in my development. It was always Scotty that really interested me, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, the story of Scotty, really, because Scotty, as we know, was discovered in 1991 by a high school teacher. And of course, we know that Scotty wasn't, the big dig didn't happen till well over 3 years later, 1994. And I was, in preparing for my remarks on this bill, I was trying to find some sources on this because I had heard all kinds of stories about this this high school teacher, Robert Gibbart, in East End, who had been out. He discovered a tooth and a vertebrae of Scotty. He reported it as he should, and then he was asked basically to keep this secret because they had to get the team together. This was a huge job. This potential discovery was extremely exciting. So this high school teacher, Robert Gibbart, had to basically sit on this secret for over 3 years. He couldn't tell anyone about this discovery he'd made. And that story always struck me. Imagine having to keep something like that secret for well over 3 years. And it's just, to me, it's a delightful little anecdote about Scotty. It sort of sends shivers to think how exciting that must have been for that high school teacher to have made that discovery. I mentioned that this was a place that loomed large in my childhood. I now have a 2.5-year-old Lou, and we take him here often. Well, mainly his dad takes him here, so often that the last time I was there a few weeks ago, the staff knew my partner by name and my child by name, which shocked me. I had no idea they'd been going so frequently. They're complete addicts, and so for my partner's birthday, I bought him a family pass to the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. We're big nerds. And it's not even Mega Munch that interests my little one so much. It's more the educational exhibits. We recently discovered Peter and the Wolf in our household. He gets a huge kick out of going to see the real wolf, well, the stuffed wolf, the snakes. He said to me the other day in the car, he's 2.5, that he thinks the wolf is a little bit scary but very beautiful, which I just thought was like a lovely way of putting it. So I look forward to him having many more years of being exposed to the wonderful things that the Royal Saskatchewan Museum has to offer, and I'm pleased to see a bill being proposed to support and continue the good work of that museum. I would also just say that I've gotten to know the staff a bit and just how wonderful they are, how welcoming, how educated, how informative, how passionate they are. So I don't have much more to say about the substance of this bill, but I did want to take this opportunity to speak to the importance of this institution within our community, but also just within my family, because of course that's the goal, to really pique the curiosity of young minds, and certainly that is certainly something I see even at this early stage with my son. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I am pleased to move to adjourn debate on Bill number 43, the Royal Saskatchewan Museum Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item 7, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 44, the Corporate Tax Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Nippy Albright.
I recognize the member from Regina Elphinstone.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to be on my feet to enter into debate on Bill number 44, the Corporation Capital Tax Amendment Act 2021. Fairly straightforward bill, contains some housekeeping items, and I understand this bill clarifies that associated corporations and affiliated persons are both included in determining if a corporation is subject to a resource surcharge. In the words of the minister, this bill levels the playing field and protects the revenue base. I myself, given my critic areas, don't have significant concerns about this bill. I know that there may be questions for the minister, but I agree it appears to be fairly straightforward. This is one of the interventions we're seeing during this COVID session into the affairs of issues that would impact small business and quite frankly larger business within Saskatchewan. And it has been, I would be remiss if I didn't identify what a difficult time it's been, but also how few supports were available to many of these businesses provincially during what has been a historical disruption to not just our health and our lives, but to our economy. And you know, again and again, I hear from especially small business owners who speak to me about, you know, how shocked they were at how little was made available to them by this government that likes to toot its own horn about the economy, that likes to take credit for the successes, the investments of the private sector when it suits them, but really left many of these folks really high and dry during such a difficult time. Almost exclusively, all of these supports came from the federal government. You know, as I heard the Premier deliver the throne speech and speak about a nation within a nation, I wondered, and maybe the member for Walsh Acres wonders as well, whether these are the kinds of arrangements that this government hopes will continue when we become the great nation within a nation. You know, if we have another pandemic or another wave, will they still expect the federal government to foot 90% of the bill? I wonder. It's just a question, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So with that, I think I'll move to adjourn debate on Bill number 44, the Corporation Capital Tax Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion.
Agreed.
Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan 3S Health Act. Ms. Nippy Albury.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview. No, pardon me, Regina Elphinstone.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to be on my feet to speak to Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan, or in brackets 3S Health Act 2020. Now, I first became familiar with the 3S Health body because it was, I believe, created to find efficiencies in the healthcare system, and it was the mechanism through which a number of lean initiatives were announced and pursued. And it's funny that lean term, it's not a term you hear a lot anymore. It was certainly something that this government was very excited about when it was first announced, but it's become one of those many terms that they don't seem to want to speak of in this House. It's one of the spectacular failures of this Sask Party government, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I am not the critic in this area. I suspect that my very able colleague from Saskatoon Fairview will, critic for health, will have more to say on this bill. But I would flag, you know, something that we will want to be keeping an eye on this side is whether this bill opens things up to further privatization. This is a theme that we've consistently seen from this government, is not just comments about their intention to do this, but some concerning steps towards this as well. And we heard mention of it even in question period from the health minister. With that, I also would just like to echo the comments of my colleague from Eastview, comments he made, you know, around expanding the responsibilities of a health minister that has really demonstrated a complete level of incompetence in dealing with this COVID pandemic. Another spectacular failure of this government was their handling of, you know, the worst fourth wave in the country, highest death rates, lowest vaccine uptake. You know, we're seeing very concerning trends in the economy as well, because, you know, this is a party that thinks that you need to decide between either the well-being of people or the economy, and it turns out you can't really succeed at one without the other. So these are some of the things that this side will be keeping an eye on, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like I said, I know that there will be further consultation on this bill, and with that, I am pleased to adjourn debate On Bill number 45, the Health Shared Services Saskatchewan 3S Health Act 2020. Adjourn debate.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. This is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Adjourn debates item 9. Resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Nippy Albury.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm honored to be on my feet here late this afternoon talking about Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act. I've taken time to, peruse the legislation, listen to the minister's comments, as well as some initial comments from my colleagues in opposition as we take time for fulsome adjourned debates to really think about how this legislation will impact Saskatchewan, especially those in need of legal aid and those who aren't able to access it for a plethora of reasons. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will acknowledge that much like many other pieces of legislation this session, this is an effort to modernize older legislation and a little bit of housekeeping involved here, changing some words, going from solicitor to lawyer and department to ministry, and updating a lot of that antiquated language that still lingers around in older legislation, as well as just kind of confirming and bringing some clarity to other changes that have taken place since this legislation has been updated. So there's really nothing here that I think would cause me in particular to stand in opposition to this bill, but I do just want to take a minute while I'm on my feet to talk about the important work of legal aid. And I've heard some comments already from my colleagues in opposition just acknowledging the vital work that folks in legal aid do for people in Saskatchewan and how much that truly is needed. Mr. Speaker, certainly we recognize that many of my colleagues in opposition have very close personal ties to the legal community in Saskatchewan, and they can speak passionately about the work done by legal aid folks in the province. But I also want to point out that there's also this other kind of group of folks in Saskatchewan, those who aren't able to access legal aid, as essentially it's only available to those on income assistance. But because we live in a province that has right now, I believe, the second lowest minimum wage in the country, and for lots of time we were dead last, right at the bottom of the heap. And other folks who are working 1, 2, or 3 jobs to provide for their families and their loved ones. We have this huge group of people who just they don't meet the bar for accessing help of legal aid, but they can't afford hundreds or potentially thousands of dollars to access a paid lawyer. Now in Saskatoon we have an amazing organization, Classic Law. They do great work and they try and fill in that gap where our government is missing in action. But they can't keep up with the demand. They can't keep up. There's just so many folks who need access to good legal advice and representation, and I think that really speaks to the economic realities that a lot of folks in Saskatchewan are facing. That when it comes time that they need a lawyer for whatever it is, maybe for a rental issue or any other, maybe it's a criminal issue, any other kind of legal issue that they might need representation for, there is that I would say a growing segment of our population that doesn't qualify for the government help but simply can't afford the legal help that they need. And so I want to bring that to the government's attention as we consider this bill, amending a previous act. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks and I will voice support for this bill and encourage those in the government benches to think about that group of people that I've identified. And I'm also just going to use this time to point out, as we think about that kind of growing economic need for folks who don't qualify for the support that this government has planned, but can't afford to provide for that legal help. I also recognize that last week we saw a report that I think it was 26.1% of children in this province are living in poverty. 26.1%. That is shameful, and I think that we're going to find out more and more. You know, we've seen this pandemic act as a bit of an X-ray, not necessarily creating all the problems, but exposing the problems under the surface. And when I think about the number of kids living in poverty, I think, well, what if one of those children's parents needed legal representation? Would they qualify for help? Some of them, yes. Many of them, no. Most of them, no. And so I think that there's a lot of these problems that have been under the surface. We've maybe known about them, some more than others. You know, I think that there's a lot of work to be done to address, you know, the working poor. Like I started off saying, those maybe working 1, 2, or even 3 jobs, provide for their families, but don't qualify for the help available and can't afford the help that they need. So, you know, with that, I will conclude my remarks. I will again voice support for this bill, but will continue listening to my colleagues in opposition as we proceed through adjourned debates. With that, I'll move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 46, the Legal Aid Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 10, resume debate in the second reading. Motion for Bill number 47, the Highways and Transportation Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Beck.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to enter into debate on Bill number 47, the Highways and Transportation Amendment Act 2021. So the summary of this bill is modernizing the operation and management of highways, and it also creates a freedom of passage provision which requires municipalities get consent to close access to public highways and gives the province the power to clear obstructions to improve safety at intersections. Mr. Speaker, I was reading through this and I looked at the the changes that are being proposed here, and what caught my eye was the new section on 12.1. And I thought this was interesting, where it has here freedom of passage 12.11, and it has here number 2, no person shall erect a gate or otherwise block or restrict the public's right to access or use a public highway. When I read that, what struck me was, you know, this pandemic. You know, I think about the First Nation communities that have closed their borders, going onto their communities, and they've restricted access through those communities, and many of those roads running through the First Nation communities are provincial roads. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I thought, now, what would the Indigenous community, the Indigenous leaders say about this proposed change, where now the province is saying what they can and cannot do, and especially when they're trying to protect their community folks. The other section that really was quite that I really had to ask my colleagues to say, am I reading this right? Is this what is being proposed? And I look at the new section 16. And it's the right to enter, acquire, expropriate, and alter land. And here it says it's that the act or the minister may, without the consent of the owner or any interested person, do any of the following. And of course, they can enter on, take possession, acquire, expropriate any lands required for the purposes of this act. They can enter on the land, survey, and take levels of land and take any borings or sign trials, etc. And the other one is enter and take and acquire. Like I just think about the communities that have issue with the current duty to consult process. I think of Turner Lake, who had surveyors enter their community. And they had issue with this. And this proposed, the changes, this amendment is giving this province the authority to do whatever the heck they want. And I think that just goes against what this government has been touting about reconciliation, about building trust, building relationships. And this proposed amendment here is basically, it's giving the ministry, the right to do whatever the heck they want. And consultation isn't even on here. Duty to consult isn't even mentioned in here. So basically, it's giving this government the power to do whatever the heck they want. That goes against the duty to consult from an Indigenous worldview, as well as reconciliation. Mr. Speaker, have the Indigenous community been consulted on this proposed change? Has the members that have Indigenous communities within their constituency asked their Indigenous neighbours what they think about these proposed amendments are? I'd be curious to know what, if any, consultation has occurred with Indigenous peoples, with landowners, municipalities, or community groups. You know, this bill is giving the province the power to enter private property to clear obstructions will be of interest to the public. Right now, there is a lot, if this government has ever paid attention to building relationships with Indigenous communities, they would ask themselves, each time they're going to enter the communities, or in this, what I'm reading here is saying that it doesn't even have to ask anybody. It doesn't even have to ask anybody. The ministry can do whatever it wants. And I don't believe the community, citizens of this province, let alone Indigenous people, would want this to happen. They need to be consulted. And if this government continues to go on about reconciliation and how well they're doing, perhaps one of the things they need to think about is consulting the Indigenous community in a meaningful way. Get out there and talk to the community groups. Talk to the users of these lands. Talk to them instead of ramming legislation through. I'm sure my colleagues here would have more to say on this, but I just want to conclude my remarks on this. And what I would like to do is adjourn debate on Bill number 47, the Highways and Transportation Amendment Act 2021.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion?
Agreed.
Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 11. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 49, the Saskatchewan Gaming Corporation Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Beck.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour to rise in the Assembly and to enter into adjourned debates on Bill number 49, the Saskatchewan Gaming Corporation Amendment Act 2021. I have enjoyed some of the comments coming from my colleagues in opposition, and I also enjoyed many of the comments from the minister as this bill was read in the Assembly. And I'll pick out a few things that I've kind of have piqued my interest here in the debate, but in the end, I will certainly voice favor for the bill, but want to see it continue through adjourned debates as we continue to listen to stakeholders and all those affected by these amendments. From looking at the legislation, I can see that this is I think a positive move that we are approaching with some, I would say, some positive outlook on to see what it does. But as this creates the ability for revenue sharing between the government of Saskatchewan and the First Nations Trust, 50-50 revenue sharing. This is a new venture here for the government to engage with leaders who work with CIGA to organize gaming in the province. And I think that right now, I think that this is a level of partnership that we are interested to see where it leads, and certainly on board with the direction that we're going. We see that there's some amendments to the Gaming Framework Agreement and amendments to this act that will allow CIGA to operate online gaming platforms. So with that 50-50 revenue sharing, I think that there are potentially some red flags there as far as what this will do for gaming in Saskatchewan, but I think that the 50-50 revenue sharing is something that I am very willing to say I initially stand in favor of. I think that I did review the minister's comments, and it was good to see, some memorable quotes from Indigenous leaders voicing favor for this. But as an overall topic of economic reconciliation, I think that that's certainly a topic that I'd like to see have more priority from this government. And if this is a step in that direction, if it is, then that's a good thing. But I think that there's further steps to go there. I think that one of the things that I've learned as a non-Indigenous person learning, I didn't encounter the history of residential schools till I was 28 or 29 years old. It was not something that I was taught in school. It was not something that I was, maybe aware of in a peripheral sort of sense, but not something that was as it is now for children in our province, a part of their formal education. This is not something that I received during my formal education. It wasn't until I took, to get into the College of Education at the U of S, I was required to take one class, a 3-credit course on Indigenous Studies. And as I've mentioned before in this Assembly, that class was transformational for me, exposing a history and a present inequality in Canada that I think I very much felt betrayed by my formal education, betrayed in many ways by my country, that I was not aware of those. And perhaps I was not personally responsible in the way that I would hope people are now. But at the time, I think I was also betrayed by the institutions that formed my years as a student in Alberta and then later in Saskatchewan. But that course kind of opened things up for me, and I became aware of this history. And one of the things that I became aware of through that course and subsequent courses and books and other learning experiences as an adult, I became aware that the history of residential schools has many forms of oppression. many forms of violence, including genocide. And one of the forms of violence that was by design in residential schools, the history that we are now having to reconcile, is economic violence. These were not schools, really, in any sense of the word. Many schools did not feature any academic work or training whatsoever. These were schools that were designed to remove the Indian from the child, but also to make sure that Indigenous peoples in Canada were removed from economic prosperity and success, not providing the kinds of training that non-Indigenous children were receiving to proceed into professions, to find success in life that would lead to, maybe upward mobility and increased income. This was not the kind of training or academics that residential schools provided. In many cases, these would be more described as labor camps, as forced labor institutions, where the children learned things that would not give them the skills that they needed to succeed, but would give them the skills required for labor-related work and jobs, manual labor work and jobs. And that was an economic design of the residential school systems, to make sure that Indigenous children ripped away from their families, their culture, and their language were also ripped away from future economic success. So as a philosophy, yes, I do believe that economic reconciliation is important. In the year 2021, I think that we are much too late to be recognizing this. And if these amendments do lead to economic, and that's maybe a big if for the changes here, I think there's a lot more to go, then that is something that I do support. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude my remarks here on Bill number 49 and move that we adjourn debate on Bill 49, the Saskatchewan Gaming Corporation Amendment Act of 2021. Thank you.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 12, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Richards.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Proud to be on my feet again to debate another bill, Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act of 2021. Again, bringing amendments to older legislation, which I think largely we've heard from members on this side that we are in favor of, but also interested in continuing and watching this bill proceed as we proceed through adjourned debates and listen to maybe different ways of looking at some of these changes. So my understanding of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is that it provides the authority to immediately suspend driver's licenses and impound vehicles for drivers charged with stunting, racing, or excessive speed. I think it's a good thing. I reviewed the minister's comments, and interesting to see that this government noticed a trend that during the pandemic, that these types of offences like speeding increased during the pandemic, especially stunting. I mean, maybe we've got to get inside the mind of folks who want to engage in this. Maybe they saw fewer people on the road, or whatever it was, or there were certainly times where it felt like, here in Regina, especially, kind of living in a bit of a ghost town, as things were so bad here last spring, and we were all forced to stay here, that there weren't as many people on the streets. So maybe that was an invitation to folks to engage in this kind of dangerous behavior. But certainly interesting that this government noticed the trend, and they decided that the best way to address that trend was with policy and legislation. Very interesting, isn't it? I'll come back to that in a minute. I understand that this legislation allows suspended drivers to legally partake in driver evaluations while in the company of an authorized driver instructor. Hopefully that training will be useful to these culprits, to those who have engaged in this type of dangerous driving, that they can use their training to be a little safer on the road to keep our whole province safe. As well as this legislation brings in some cohesiveness on road signs and kind of bring it all under one umbrella, I think is a good idea. You know, I think that we do hear concerns about racing and stunting. You know, somebody who's worked with young people my whole life, they're not always model citizens behind the wheel, and I have definitely called a parent or two in my time when I see them driving dangerously around the high schools where I've worked. But you know, I do want to maybe just key in on a couple comments here from the minister. And as the minister was speaking to this bill in the Assembly, the minister noted that that there were some trends in driving during the pandemic. And I mentioned this just for a moment earlier, that there were trends, and that there were trends of increased speeding and stunting that necessitated a response from the government. And I just have a hard time accepting that this government was paying attention enough to notice changes in people's driving, but they didn't notice changes in the increasing COVID numbers throughout the summer. This government took 48 days off between COVID briefings, 48 days, without noticing or communicating with the province on the changes in COVID as the fourth wave was taking off. They clearly have the ability to notice when trends change, as they've indicated in this legislation, but they did not notice that the path, the road that they were on, would lead to the worst COVID death rates in the country, the worst ICU admissions of any province at any point during the entire pandemic. I just have a hard time, and that here, the Minister for SGI is talking about changes in driving patterns, while that same minister and that same government blocked SGI from implementing health policies to keep their workers safe. The hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker, is unbelievable. It is unbelievable that that minister would talk about the trends in driving patterns while denying workers at SGI the right to be safe on the job. Unbelievable, Mr. Speaker. Now, with that comment, I will voice support for the changes in this bill, but I want to continue listening to my colleagues in opposition, and so I do move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 50, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act of 2021.
Member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Orders, adjourn debates. Item number 13, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 51, the Privacy, Intimate Images, Additional Remedies Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Conway.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Speaker. I'm on my feet again to speak to Bill number 51, the Privacy Amendment Act 2021. This act is to this act was first amended. Government first amended the Privacy Act in 2019, which created a tort for the non-consensual distribution of intimate images. The bill expands the remedy for non-consensual distribution of intimate images, including requiring the defendant to return any copies of visual recordings, includes threatening to distribute to the tort, including the depiction of an individual in a definition of protected images to address fake or altered images, requires the defendant and an internet intermediary to make every reasonable effort to remove all visuals of the victim. You know, I'm pleased that there's something that is being proposed here to protect the victims, because often victims, as a society, we forget about those victims and we just don't care. And the victims of this horrendous crime are disproportionately women. The tort is designed as a tool that victims can use to gain some retribution, also to hopefully deter people from committing the crime. I also want to say that this gives the victim a bit of their power back that was taken away from them. Because when stuff like this happens, it's very traumatic for victims. And victims often face challenges with mental health, questioning themselves. There's stories about suicides. And I'm in favor of this, to have tougher measures in place to protect the victims and to give them some sort of power back and to give them their lives back. Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 51, the Privacy Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. As a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Agreed. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 14. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Conway.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief tonight, or this afternoon, with respect to Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021. I understand that this bill would act to ensure suspended drivers maintain insurance coverage when they're attending SGI mandated driver evaluation. I understand that the current act is unclear as to whether suspended drivers are insured while participating in driver training, road tests, and other driver assessments. I'd submit that these are important updates, a bit housekeeping in nature, but certainly not if there's a gap in coverage that needs to be extended there. So that sounds like a practical and important measure. Certainly we need to make sure that drivers that are taking driver training or evaluations or testing should be insured. I know our critic will be engaged in thoughtful consultations with stakeholders on this front. I'd invite any impacted stakeholders with perspective with respect to the consequences of this legislation to be in touch with our critic. It'll be our aim to be as constructive as we can with a piece of legislation like this and make sure that we take every opportunity to strengthen this piece of legislation. With that being said, with respect to Bill number 52, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2021, I'll adjourn debate.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. As a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Agreed. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 15. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 53, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2021. Ms. Young, Regina University.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you much, Mr. Speaker. I'm here to speak again and enter into debate on Bill number 53, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2021. So the Act is used to repeal outdated and obsolete legislation that are no longer in use. And I am very in favor of modernizing legislation so that we are relevant. So this year, the Agricultural Safety Net Act, the Pastures Act, the Act to incorporate additional municipal hail limited, and an act to incorporate Sisters of St. Martha are being repealed. The focus is to modernize and clear out unused legislation. And this bill is a housekeeping bill focused on repealing the old and unused legislation. So it's very important that we modernize legislation to be relevant today and to reflect the changes in our society. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I move to adjourn debate on Bill number 53, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2021. Miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Agreed. Carried.
Orders, adjourn debates. Item number 16, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 54, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Mowat.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to be on my feet today to introduce some comments on Bill number 54, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Act 2021. As has been noted, the bill amends the 3 acts to allow lawyers and witnesses power of attorney, wills, and healthcare directives remotely via electronic means. This is something I've had the opportunity personally to take advantage of and have found it quite convenient. I understand, obviously, this was a result of some temporary as well as permanent regulations that were passed due to the COVID-19 pandemic to allow for this and must now, of course, be included in the Act. Of course, Mr. Speaker, all members in this House believe that it's important for people to access legal services regardless of location or ability, and I see this as a much-needed change to allow for greater access to justice, as well as formalizing what was made practice during the COVID-19 pandemic, Mr. Speaker. I'm a fan of anything that will ease some of the administrative burden, as well as improve access, whether remotely or in person, to justice. I know the critic will engage with this in committee, but with that, Mr. Speaker, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 54.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 17, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 55, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Conway.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my privilege to enter some comments into the record in regards to Bill number 55, the Miscellaneous Statutes Remote Witnessing Amendment Act 2021, number 2. I've already given some comments in relation to Bill number 54, my comments in regards to Bill number 55 would be much the same, allowing for electronic witnessing of documents such as healthcare directives or power of attorney or wills. Of course, increases efficiency, hopefully decreases the administrative burden, as well as increasing access to justice. One of the small, I think, I hesitate to use the word benefits, but one of the interesting things to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic has, of course, been the continued modernization of the legal world, as well as many others. And of course, it's critical for all people to have access to wills, power of attorney, healthcare directives, and above all things, justice, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'm happy to conclude my remarks here, and I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 55.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 18, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 56, the Queen's Bench Amendment Act 2021. Is Beck.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm happy to enter in with some comments on behalf of the opposition with respect to Bill 56, the Queen's Bench Amendment Act 2021. As the Minister had mentioned in his remarks, the Act sets out criteria for the operation of the Superior Court. Amendments in this bill are needed in order to reflect the current makeup of the court, as well as to modernize the court's ability to assign residency. There is also an update, Mr. Speaker, to the number of judges who comprise the Court of Queen's Bench. We see an increase here of 2 judges to reflect the current number of judges on the bench. The bill also contains new provisions that will permit the court to make an order to allow changes to beneficiary designation for people without capacity to do so. Mr. Speaker, decision makers for those without capacity can make an application to the court to make changes regarding beneficiary designations. Finally, this bill also includes a number of housekeeping items, Mr. Speaker, with the purpose of addressing outdated legislation references as well as outdated ministerial titles. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to note that the opposition welcomes modernization of the Act to reflect the Superior Court. The reflection of the number of family law judges is also important here since this area of law oversees many cases. Mr. Speaker, we'll be having some more detailed questions around the changes to the beneficiary designations, and our critic will be reaching out to stakeholders to solicit feedback, especially on this front. We'd like to hear in more detail about the rationale for these changes being made, and would also like to know what level of consultation has been undertaken by the government around these changes. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'm comfortable at this point to adjourn debate on Bill 56, the Queen's Bench Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
First, adjourn debates. Item number 19. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021. Mr. Love.
Recognize the member from Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to enter into an interesting piece of legislation with respect to land titles and our mining industry, Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021. Certainly, we need to ensure integrity and fairness in our land title system as it relates to our mining and resource sector. A sector that's just so vital and so important to Saskatchewan. I've read the minister's comments with respect to the reason for the change and the balance that they're working to find to limit a certain assurance claims that would place an unfair burden on public funds, and not just limit but prohibit certain claims. I understand that would be accomplished, they would accomplish this in 3 ways. For both service and mineral titles. The changes would clarify that a loss should be valued at the time of the error occurred, so not sort of the inflation or the escalation of the value of that title. That there'd be a cap of $50,000 in compensation. That would be implemented with respect to mines and minerals, and there'd be a prohibition on compensation where a registrar's caveat was filed more than 20 years ago. This is a very important industry, a sophisticated industry. It's critical that we make changes that have integrity and that serve the best interests of our province, the public, and value this industry. So we'll be engaged in consultation with these valued stakeholders on this front. It's very important that we hear their interests and that we make sure we stand up for the public's interest. With that being said, Mr. Speaker, I would adjourn debate at this point in time on Bill number 57, the Land Titles Amendment Act 2021.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It is a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. It now being near 5 o'clock, this House stands adjourned, recessed till 7 p.m.